By the late 12th century BC, the river valleys of temperate Western Europe carried a quiet but decisive shift in human settlement. Small agrarian communities along the Seine, the Loire, and the Upper Rhine began organizing their fields with clearer boundaries, their metallurgical workshops with more regular workflows, and their storage pits with an efficiency that implied a growing surplus. Archaeological evidence from early Hallstatt layers shows the controlled burning of forest margins, the hardening of long-distance exchange routes, and the first signs of social hierarchy visible in grave goods arranged with deliberate symmetry. Meanwhile, climatic reconstructions indicate a gradual stabilization of seasonal rainfall that allowed communities to experiment with heavier wagon designs and more productive cereal rotations. These developments did not yet constitute a civilization, but they set the foundation for one, a mosaic of tribes that would eventually be known collectively as the Gauls, a network of culturally related peoples whose political structures, artistic expressions, and martial systems shaped the Western European landscape for more than a millennium. The emergence of these societies matters because it illustrates how complex cultural identities can form not through empires or centralized authorities, but through interconnected local systems that adapted continuously to geography, trade, and conflict. Continue as we examine how river, ritual, and record shaped the societies later recognized as the Gauls. By 1200 BC, the river valleys of Western Europe carried a set of environmental and cultural conditions that would gradually shape the earliest foundations of what would later be recognized as the Celtic-speaking communities. The landscape was defined by dense temperate forests, braided river systems, and an emerging pattern of agricultural clearances that began to alter ecological rhythms. Archaeological evidence from early Late Bronze Age settlements along the Upper Danube reveals modest clusters of longhouses organized around shared storage pits, with charred botanical remains indicating mixed cultivation of barley, emmer, and hardy legumes suited to cooler climates. Nearby, slag deposits from small metallurgical hearths show that bronze production, still reliant on distant sources of tin, had reached a level of technical consistency that supported both everyday tools and prestige objects. Stratigraphic data from these village sites demonstrate increasingly stable occupation layers, suggesting a shift from mobile agropastoral patterns to semi-permanent settlement forms that encouraged investment in land, kin networks, and material production. Meanwhile, climate reconstructions from lakebed cores across Central Europe indicate a period of relative stability following earlier fluctuations, creating predictable growing seasons and allowing communities to expand storage capacity. This shift in environmental reliability led to changes in landscape management visible in pollen records, which show steady reductions in forest density near habitation zones. The expansion of arable land did not proceed through rapid deforestation, but through gradual, deliberate clearing, often accompanied by controlled burning, whose microstratified ash layers remain visible in excavations today. Such adjustments reflect a community mindset increasingly oriented toward territorial continuity, where fields and pastures were not temporary resources but intergenerational foundations. As these agricultural systems became more stable, long-distance exchange networks also intensified. Material culture found at settlement sites across southern Germany and eastern France includes imported bronze types, whose alloy composition indicates multi-regional sourcing. These objects, pins, fibulae, and socketed axes, testify to itinerant specialists who traveled along river corridors linking distant cultural zones. The presence of foreign materials reveals that these early communities were neither isolated nor static. Instead, they occupied a landscape defined by fluid movement of goods, ideas, and techniques. Excavations at sites near the Upper Rhine show standardized casting molds used across wide geographic ranges, indicating a shared technological vocabulary. This distribution suggests that emerging identities in the region developed through interaction and convergence rather than separation. The burial record provides another anchor for understanding this gradual shift toward more complex social patterns. By the late 12th and early 11th centuries BC, grave assemblages across modern-day France and Switzerland display notable increases in personal ornamentation. Cemeteries show careful spatial organization, with grave orientations often aligning along local geomorphological features such as ridgelines or river terraces. Radiocarbon dates place many of these burials within narrow temporal bands, demonstrating coordinated ritual behavior across related communities. Weapons appear only sporadically, while items associated with craft production, awls, knives, spinning tools, indicate that social status may have been tied to household productivity or specialized labor rather than martial distinction. The controlled deposition of bronze objects, often arranged symmetrically beside the deceased, adds a cinematic precision to the archaeological record. Metal surfaces placed deliberately against organic materials, preserved in compacted soils that still retain faint impressions of textiles. Linguistic studies, although indirect, further support the picture of a region undergoing gradual cultural synthesis rather than abrupt transformation. The emergence of early Celtic speech communities is believed to have unfolded through processes of trade-mediated interaction among related Indo-European groups. Mobility rather than migration appears to have been the primary driver, with vocabulary relating to metalwork, transport, and social hierarchy spreading along exchange routes. This linguistic diffusion aligns with the archaeological evidence of shared material types, suggesting that the earliest phase of what would later become the Celtic world grew from continuous contact zones rather than a centralized origin point. Conceptually, this period marks an important stage in human organization, the slow abstraction of territorial identity. Communities no longer define themselves solely through immediate ecological resources, but began associating identity with broader networks of exchange, technology, and ritual practice. This shift allowed for forms of social cohesion that could persist even as groups moved or expanded, creating the foundations for a cultural continuum that would later encompass the diverse tribes known collectively as the Gauls. Across these centuries, modest agricultural villages evolved into structured communities with recognizable patterns of craft specialization, ritual behavior, and regional interaction. Evidence from habitation layers, burial sites, and metallurgical debris all points toward an incremental but steady consolidation of cultural norms. These developments illustrate how the roots of Celtic identity formed not from dramatic turning points, but from accumulating adaptations to environment, economy, and social practice. By the beginning of the first millennium BC, Western Europe had become a landscape in motion, shaped by communities whose increasing complexity set the stage for the Hallstatt ascendancy that would define the next major phase of the region's history. By the early first millennium BC, a distinct pattern of fortified settlement began emerging across the landscapes of Central and Western Europe. Excavations at hilltop sites such as the Huneberg reveal early phases of rampart construction, combining timber, earth, and stone in alternating layers, whose preserved impressions document evolving engineering techniques. These elevated settlements, positioned to command river access and agricultural hinterlands, signal a growing concern with territorial control. Stratigraphic sequences show repeated episodes of rebuilding, each layer representing not crisis but refinement. Thicker timber frames, more compacted earth, and better drainage systems. Archaeological evidence from interior structures indicates specialized zones within these sites, where storage pits, hearths, and metalworking areas were delineated by packed clay floors that still bear the marks of repeated, structured use. Such organization reflects administrative behaviors in embryo form, grounded in the management of surplus and the coordination of labor. Meanwhile, increasing quantities of imported goods reveal expanding external connections. Mediterranean pottery found in early Hallstatt strata at sites along the Rhone suggests that trade networks had extended far beyond local river corridors. Residue analysis on some of these vessels has detected traces of resonated wine, offering insight into the goods exchanged and the preferences of a rising elite class. These imports did not transform local habits immediately, but they signaled the arrival of ideas about status, ceremony, and long-distance political relationships. The controlled distribution of such goods within settlements hints at the emergence of individuals capable of mediating between local production systems and external exchange networks. Their influence, visible in the archaeological record through access to rare materials, represents one of the earliest identifiable markers of hierarchy within these developing societies. Burial evidence from this period further strengthens the impression of rising social differentiation. At sites across southern Germany and eastern France, tumulus graves from the early Hallstatt era contain increasingly elaborate assemblages. In some burials, wooden chambers were constructed before interment, their walls reinforced by carefully placed planks whose joinery points to skilled carpentry. Within these rooms, bodies were positioned alongside metal ornaments, amber beads, and tools that indicate both personal identity and social standing. Radiocarbon dating clusters many of these high-status graves within concentrated periods, suggesting coordinated ritual events. Excavations at the Magdalenburg tumulus reveal a central burial that appears to have served as a focal point for surrounding satellite graves, forming a ceremonial landscape organized with spatial intention. Such configurations signal complex notions of ancestry and authority, where lineage and memory were materialized through monumental architecture. Parallel to these elite expressions, evidence from domestic contexts shows technological innovations that transformed daily life. The increasing use of iron, detectable through metallurgical debris and tool remains, marks a pivotal shift. Iron's availability, although initially limited, gradually expanded the range of implements available to farmers and craftsmen. Environmental archaeology provides additional detail. Charcoal analysis from smelting sites indicates selection of specific tree species, implying knowledge of combustion properties and fuel management. Iron tools, heavier plowshares, durable knives, and robust woodworking blades allowed for more intensive land cultivation and the construction of more stable dwellings. These changes, though subtle in individual instances, collectively contributed to a landscape increasingly shaped by human intention rather than ecological constraint. The attention to landscape is further evident in the spatial organization of settlements. Remote sensing surveys across the Upper Rhine Valley have revealed clusters of field systems arranged in rectilinear blocks, some bounded by shallow ditches. While not uniform, these patterns suggest early attempts at land division and tenure, marking a transition toward more formalized systems of property and inheritance. The repetition of such patterns across multiple regions points to shared cultural practices rather than isolated innovations. Conceptually, this structuring of land reflects a deeper shift in the relationship between community and environment. Fields were no longer temporary clearings, but fixed resources embedded in emerging social frameworks. As these developments unfolded, linguistic diffusion continued to weave together the identities of scattered groups. Although the precise roots of language spread remain debated, archaeological correlates, shared weapon forms, decorative styles, and burial customs suggest patterns of cultural convergence across vast areas. This convergence does not imply homogeneity. Rather, it highlights the flexibility of these communities, which adopted common elements while retaining regional variability. Material culture thus provides the anchor points through which early Celtic-speaking societies can be identified, not as a single unified people, but as interconnected groups participating in a broader cultural trajectory. The cumulative outcome of these processes was the gradual formation of larger, more structured social units. The archaeological record, with its evidence of fortified settlements, differential burials, technological innovation, and long-distance trade, reveals a world in transition. Communities were becoming more complex, more hierarchical, and more interconnected. These transformations set the stage for the emergence of the Hallstatt elite centers, whose influence would shape the cultural and political landscape of Iron Age Europe. The deep roots of the Gauls lie in this long period of adjustment and adaptation, where environmental stability, technological change, and social organization converged into a recognizable cultural horizon. By the 9th and 8th centuries BC, the emerging networks of exchange and the developing hierarchy of hilltop settlements began to coalesce into a more recognizable cultural horizon across Central and Western Europe. One of the clearest indicators of this consolidation is the increasingly standardized production of prestige goods. Metallurgical studies from workshops near the Upper Danube show recurring alloy ratios in bronze fittings, suggesting that artisans operated within shared technical conventions rather than isolated local traditions. These workshops, identified through slag concentrations and furnace remnants, reveal spatial organization that separates smelting, casting, and finishing areas. Such differentiation indicates an advanced understanding of workflow, efficiency, and community-level coordination. Archaeological evidence suggests that these craft centers supplied both local needs and regional exchange, linking groups into the broader cultural sphere that scholars associate with the early Celtic world. Meanwhile, advances in transportation technology further shape the contours of this cultural landscape. Evidence from fortified settlements, such as the Huneberg, reveals wheel components made from carefully split timber, their surfaces smoothed through repeated shaping. The construction of four-spoked wheels and standardized axle widths implies the widespread use of wagons designed for long-distance travel. Traces of parallel ruts carved into ancient paths near river crossings support this interpretation, indicating regular heavy traffic that created faint but distinct impressions still visible in the soil today. These technological developments enabled more efficient movement across varied terrain, expanding the radius of trade and facilitating political alliances that stretched across multiple ecological zones. The burial record continues to serve as a central indicator of societal transformation. In large tumulus fields, archaeologists have documented patterns of interments that reflect increasingly complex kin structures. At some sites, families appear to have maintained burial rites over specific mounds for multiple generations, with each new interment accompanied by grave goods echoing earlier assemblages. Radiocarbon sequences show tight chronological clustering within these tumuli, suggesting intentional maintenance of lineage identity. Excavations at sites such as the Ipf reveal burials that combine imported luxury goods, Greek ceramics, Etruscan bronze vessels, with locally crafted ornaments featuring geometric motifs. The presence of these hybrid assemblages indicates that elites were integrating external symbols of prestige into local traditions, reinforcing their authority while maintaining cultural continuity. Environmental evidence provides additional insight into the growth of these elite networks. Pollen analyses from upland basins in southern Germany show significant increases in grass and cereal indicators, marking expanded cultivation. These agricultural changes did not result solely from population pressure. Instead, they reflect deliberate intensification strategies by communities seeking to support larger settlements and more hierarchical social structures. Soil micromorphology studies reveal trampled surfaces within enclosures that indicate repeated large gatherings, possibly associated with feasting or political councils. Combination of intensifying agriculture and concentrated ritual activity illustrates a society in which social cohesion relied on communal events capable of reinforcing shared identities across multiple settlements. The role of feasting in this period becomes increasingly visible through archaeological deposits. At numerous sites, refuse pits contain large quantities of animal bones, particularly cattle and pigs, processed in ways that suggest consumption on a scale beyond household needs. Cut mark patterns on these remains indicate standardized butchery techniques, while vessel fragments from oversized cauldrons point toward coordinated communal rituals. These events likely served as mechanisms for consolidating elite authority, where leaders distributed food, displayed imported goods, and affirmed alliances. Residue analysis on pottery from some of these contexts has detected traces of mead or other fermented beverages, adding a sensory dimension to scenes of large-scale social gatherings. The sound of tools striking bone, the smell of roasting meat, and the light reflecting off polished bronze vessels are details preserved indirectly through the archaeological record, grounding these moments in material precision rather than imaginative reconstruction. Conceptually, the increasing prominence of feasting represents a significant psychological development within these communities. It signals a shift from household-level identity to broader communal affiliation, where public gatherings created shared memories and reinforced the legitimacy of emerging elites. These events also provided opportunities for integrating external influences, as imported Mediterranean vessels were often displayed in ceremonial contexts that emphasized their symbolic value as markers of connection to distant lands. As the 8th century progressed, the cumulative effect of technological innovation, agricultural expansion, intensified ritual activity, and long-distance exchange produced a cultural environment primed for further transformation. The archaeological record shows increasing uniformity in certain artifact types, weaponry, ornaments, pottery forms, suggesting that communication among regions had reached a level of regularity that allowed for widespread stylistic transmission. This pattern does not indicate centralization, but rather the emergence of a networked cultural sphere that transcended local boundaries without erasing regional identities. These developments laid the foundations for the Hallstatt ascendancy, a period characterized by the rise of powerful elites whose influence shaped the social and political structure of Iron Age Europe. The transition from the deep roots of late Bronze Age communities to the complex structures of the early Iron Age marks the first major transformation in the long story of the peoples who would later be identified as the Gauls. Environmental stability, craft specialization, ritual elaboration, and mobility converged to create a cultural landscape defined by both continuity and innovation, setting the stage for the next chapter in the evolution of Celtic-speaking societies. By the later 8th and early 7th centuries BC, the cultural trajectory that had been unfolding across Western and Central Europe reached a threshold where the cumulative weight of technological, agricultural, and social changes reshaped the very structure of community life. Evidence from large fortified settlements shows substantial increases in architectural complexity. At Huenberg, excavations have uncovered mudbrick fortifications built atop timber frames, a construction technique that bears striking resemblance to methods used in Mediterranean regions. Radiocarbon analysis places these structures among the earliest examples of mudbrick architecture north of the Alps, suggesting that knowledge of new building practices circulated through expanding exchange networks. This architectural innovation demonstrates not only technical adaptation, but also symbolic intent, as imposing fortifications signaled the authority and permanence of emerging elite groups. Within these fortified centers, internal organization grew increasingly formalized. Archaeological investigations reveal zones dedicated to distinct activities, spacious storage areas where large ceramic jars once held grain and preserved food, craft sectors with specialized hearths for bronze casting and iron forging, and residential quarters arranged along pathways that follow consistent spatial logic. Soil chemistry analysis within these spaces identifies concentrations of phosphates and trace metals, allowing researchers to map specific activity patterns with remarkable precision. Such data indicate that inhabitants adhered to structured routines that balanced production, storage, ritual, and domestic duties in ways that reflect coordinated community planning. This rise in organizational complexity coincided with intensified long-distance interaction. Ivory fragments recovered from elite residences at Huenberg and other contemporaneous centers point to contacts extending as far as the Mediterranean and possibly even North Africa. These materials, often worked into combs or decorative inlays, were rare and deliberately displayed, reinforcing the status of those who controlled their distribution. Amphory fragments found in the same contexts show evidence of imported wine, expanding the suite of goods involved in elite feasting rituals. Such items were not simply luxuries, they functioned as instruments of political strategy. Their presence at gatherings transformed social relationships, turning elite households into focal points of authority shaped by the careful presentation of rare commodities. Meanwhile, ritual landscapes evolved in parallel with these material changes. Excavations at sanctuaries located near fortified settlements revealed deposits of weapons, tools, and animal remains intentionally placed within pits or water features. These offerings, arranged with deliberate symmetry, illustrate the integration of spiritual practices into the political life of early Iron Age societies. Wooden posts, once ornamented with carvings or painted surfaces, marked ceremonial spaces whose exact functions remain partly elusive, yet archaeologically traceable through post-hole alignments and compacted soil surfaces. The rhythm of these ritual activities, cyclical, communal, and deeply embedded in landscape, reinforced shared cultural identities across regional boundaries. The impact of iron technology continued to expand during this period. The increased availability of iron tools, evidenced by growing quantities of smithing slag and discarded implements, allowed communities to manage land more intensively. Woodlands were cleared with greater efficiency, fields were expanded, and livestock enclosures took more permanent form. Environmental studies of pollen sequences from river terraces in Burgundy and the Upper Rhine show a marked rise in pastoral indicators, particularly grasses associated with grazing. These patterns reflect deliberate landscape management strategies that balanced cereal cultivation with animal husbandry. Together, these economic shifts supported the demographic growth visible in expanding settlement sizes and more densely packed habitation layers. Conceptually, the broader significance of these developments lies in the formation of a cultural horizon defined by shared practices rather than centralized governance. The communities of this era did not constitute a unified political entity, yet their material culture reveals strong lines of connection. Similar burial customs, comparable settlement planning, standardized craft techniques, and parallel forms of elite display. These shared structures created a cultural environment capable of sustaining long-distance alliances, transmitting technological innovations, and supporting increasingly stratified social systems. The emerging identity of these interconnected groups, grounded in material evidence rather than mythic coherence, forms the foundation of what would later be understood as the early Celtic world. As the 7th century progressed, the archaeological record shows unmistakable signs of a new social order. Fortified settlements grew larger and more elaborate, burial mounds became monumental in scale, and exchange networks expanded to unprecedented distances. Together, these trends signal the transition into the Hallstatt period, when elite centers exerted regional influence and long-distance connections became integral to political authority. The deep roots of the Gauls lie in this centuries-long transformation, a movement from dispersed agrarian communities to complex societies capable of shaping the cultural landscape of Iron Age Europe. The rise of these elite centers, with their imposing architecture, specialized economies, and expanding networks, forms the threshold of the next stage in this historical development. From these foundations emerged the structures that would define the Hallstatt ascendancy and set the trajectory leading toward the societies later identified as the Gauls. By the early 7th century BC, the cultural landscape that had taken shape across Central and Western Europe entered a phase defined by the emergence of powerful elite centers, each positioned to control long-distance exchange routes stretching from the Alps to the Mediterranean. This moment, known archaeologically as the Hallstatt ascendancy, is marked by an unmistakable consolidation of authority visible through material culture, settlement design, and the increasing complexity of burial rites. Excavations at major hill forts such as Mont Lassois reveal carefully planned internal structures arranged around large open courtyards where monumental wooden buildings once stood. Soil impressions and post-hole patterns indicate multi-room complexes with elevated floors and decorated facades, constructed with an attention to symmetry that signals both technical skill and aesthetic control. Meanwhile, stratigraphic sequences across these sites show repeated construction episodes that reflect long-term stability rather than transient occupation, demonstrating that these centers functioned as sustained political and economic hubs. The clearest evidence of elite consolidation lies in the princely burials associated with these hill forts. The grave at Vix, for example, contains the massive bronze crater whose dimensions, standing more than a meter tall, convey the scale of Mediterranean importation during this period. Metallurgical analyses confirm its origins in the Greek world, while residue studies inside the vessel suggest its use in ceremonial contexts, likely involving the mixing of wine during feasts orchestrated to reinforce political alliances. The burial chamber itself, constructed from heavy timbers arranged with deliberate precision, held adornments crafted from gold, amber, and finely worked bronze. Such assemblages illustrate the extent to which elite authority relied on the accumulation and display of objects tied to distant networks. These burials served as material declarations of power, presenting a lineage sustained through both local productivity and foreign connection. Long-distance trade networks underpin much of the Hallstatt system. Archaeological evidence from the Rhone corridor shows regular movement of wine amphorae, Etruscan bronze vessels, and small luxury goods northward, while amber, salt, furs, and metalwork traveled south. Salt, in particular, formed the economic backbone of several Hallstatt centers. Mines at Hallstatt and Duenberg, preserved with extraordinary clarity, reveal tunnels reinforced with wood that has survived in cold, stable conditions. Radiocarbon dates cluster these structures within narrow periods of intensive mining activity, while preserved tools, wooden shovels, picks, and leather sacks, offer rare glimpses into the daily life of miners whose labor supplied entire regions. The scale of these operations suggests organized management, with extraction, transport, and distribution coordinated in ways that required sustained leadership. The economic value of salt, used for preservation, seasoning, and perhaps ritual, provided a resource around which elites structured networks of influence. The impact of these exchange systems becomes visible within settlements through the presence of imported ceramics, metal fittings, and ornaments not produced locally. At Mont-Lassois, analytical studies of ceramic assemblages reveal distinct clusters of Mediterranean ware interspersed with local pottery, demonstrating controlled distribution rather than unrestricted access. This pattern implies that elites curated the flow of foreign goods, embedding their authority in monopolies over prestige materials. Meanwhile, workshops within these settlements produced fine metal objects, fibulae, torques, and weapon fittings, whose styles circulated widely across the region. Such production centers acted as nodes of technological transmission, standardizing certain forms while allowing regional variations to persist. These economic and material developments were mirrored by transformations in social hierarchy. Burial evidence across the Hallstatt zone demonstrates increasingly stratified communities, where grave goods vary dramatically in quality and quantity. Some graves contain only modest assemblages of pottery and tools, while others display armor, ornate jewelry, and imported vessels arranged with ceremonial care. This differentiation points to a society where elite authority was both hereditary and deeply intertwined with ritual expression. Environmental evidence supports this interpretation. Pollen records from upland zones indicate expansions of pastureland, suggesting that elites maintained large herds whose management required organized labor and control over extensive landscapes. At the same time, fields around major centers show signs of intensified cultivation, visible through deeper plow marks preserved beneath later layers. Conceptually, the rise of the Hallstatt elite represents more than economic concentration. It marks the emergence of ideological structures that linked power to ancestry, display, and distance. The ability to acquire goods from far-off regions and redistribute them in controlled settings transformed elite households into symbolic bridges between local communities and the wider world. This dynamic reshaped social expectations, making external connection a defining feature of authority. As these centers expanded, their influence stitched together disparate regions into a shared cultural horizon, setting the stage for the Latin transformation that would follow. The momentum generated by their networks, architecture, and ritual forms created the foundation upon which later Celtic-speaking societies would build their political and artistic systems, establishing patterns that endured for centuries. Across the Hallstatt world, evidence of increasingly structured craft specialization reveals the deepening complexity of elite-controlled economies. Excavations within fortified centers, such as the Huenberg, have uncovered entire zones devoted to metallurgical production, where smiths operated furnaces arranged in rows that indicate deliberate planning rather than ad hoc placement. Soil chemistry studies identify elevated concentrations of copper, tin, and iron residues in these areas, mapping the spatial distribution of manufacturing stages from smelting to finishing. The uniformity of tools recovered, chisels, hammerstones, and tongs forged to consistent dimensions, suggests standardized craftsmanship governed by technical traditions transmitted across generations. This degree of specialization implies coordinated labor systems where artisans likely worked under the protection or direct patronage of elite households, embedding economic production within political authority. Simultaneously, pottery assemblages show clear evidence of regional workshops producing vessels in large quantities. Petrographic analyses of clay sources demonstrate that potters selected specific riverine deposits whose mineral composition allowed for durable, high-temperature firing. The presence of kilns built with stone linings and controlled air channels indicates a level of precision that transformed ceramic production into a reliable, repeatable process. These kilns enabled potters to create finer tableware for elite use, as well as sturdier storage vessels essential for managing surplus grain. The distribution of these ceramics across surrounding settlements reveals supply networks radiating outward from major centers, illustrating how Hallstatt elites orchestrated both prestige and practical economies. The growth of these economic systems reshaped settlement patterns. Surveys across the Upper Rhine and Danube valleys reveal dense networks of smaller satellite communities positioned near fortified centers, their layouts oriented toward access routes leading to the hill forts. Radiocarbon sequences indicate that many of these smaller sites were occupied contemporaneously with princely centers, suggesting a hierarchical settlement structure where local villages supplied agricultural goods, raw materials, and labor. This relationship is visible archaeologically in the presence of unfinished goods and raw materials in rural contexts, contrasted with high-quality finished products found within major fortifications. Such patterns reflect a structured regional economy in which elites controlled not only trade, but also the flow of production. The complexity of Hallstatt society is further underscored by the scale and organization of monumental burial mounds. At the Hochdorf site, the central burial chamber, constructed from massive oak planks carefully jointed and sealed, contained a wealth of artifacts arranged with geometric precision. Analyses of textile fragments discovered within the chamber reveal fine weaving techniques using dyed threads, indicating specialized knowledge of plant-based pigments and complex loom structures. Nearby weapon deposits, including long iron swords with intricately patterned hilts, point to ceremonial rather than pragmatic functions. The deceased was placed on a bronze couch, whose detailed repoussé work depicts scenes of warriors and chariots, suggesting a symbolic vocabulary shared across elite networks. Environmental studies around the tumulus show layers of trampled soil consistent with large gatherings, possibly connected to funerary rites that reinforced the social order embodied in such monuments. These elaborate burials highlight the concept of authority tied to lineage, mobility, and participation in long-distance exchange. The objects interred, with origins in Greece, Etruria, and the Alpine regions, demonstrate that elites portrayed themselves not merely as local leaders, but as participants in a broader world of interconnected polities. This projection of power was reinforced through feasting practices that left distinct signatures in the archaeological record. Large quantities of animal remains found in refuse pits near princely centers indicate communal events of significant scale. Cut mark patterns on cattle and pig bones reveal standardized butchery sequences performed by skilled specialists. Residue analysis on drinking vessels recovered from these contexts shows traces of wine mixed with herbs, underscoring the incorporation of Mediterranean consumption practices into local ceremonial life. Conceptually, feasting served as a mechanism for consolidating elite authority within increasingly stratified communities. These gatherings structured social relationships through shared consumption, reinforcing hierarchical distinctions while fostering cohesion across extended networks of dependents and allies. The combination of imported vessels, locally crafted prestige items, and abundant food created a sensory environment in which political legitimacy was enacted and reaffirmed. The illumination of bronze surfaces by firelight the sound of coordinated butchery, and the communal movement within large ceremonial halls are not speculative elements, but material realities inferred directly from excavation data and spatial analysis. As elite centers grew, their influence extended beyond economic and ritual systems into forms of regional governance. Evidence from linear earthworks and territorial boundaries suggests that some Hallstatt polities asserted control over significant tracts of land. These boundaries, preserved as faint ditches or embankments, align with natural features such as ridgelines and rivers, indicating strategically defined limits. The development of such territorial markers reflects increasing political organization, where elites not only managed internal resources but also negotiated borders with neighboring groups. This territoriality, grounded in material and environmental evidence, reveals the early stages of political structures that would later characterize the tribal configurations of the Latine world. As the Hallstatt ascendancy matured, its networks, hierarchies, and ideological systems created a cultural momentum that would eventually transition into the next great phase of Celtic development, the Latine transformation, where new artistic, martial, and social patterns would reshape the contours of power across Western Europe. By the 6th century BC, the Hallstatt world had reached a point where its internal dynamics were increasingly shaped by the tension between stability and expansion. The elite centers that dominated the landscape, Huneberg, Montlassois, Glauberg, and others, operated as political engines fueled by the control of resources, labor, and long-distance exchange. Excavations at these hill forts reveal continual modification of architectural layouts, suggesting communities engaged in cycles of renewal designed to reinforce authority. At Huneberg, for example, a monumental outer wall, constructed using mud brick over a timber framework, was rebuilt several times, each iteration thicker and more imposing. Stratigraphic analysis of these walls shows alternating layers of clay, stone, and organic material arranged with technical precision that reflects both engineering expertise and symbolic intent. Such fortifications were more than defensive structures. They were spatial declarations of the power held within their boundaries. Within these fortified complexes, evidence of wide-ranging administrative activity becomes increasingly visible. Storage facilities capable of holding large quantities of grain indicate systems of collection and redistribution. Ceramic assemblages from these areas include numerous large storage jars, some bearing residues of cereals, pulses, or fermented beverages, suggesting the accumulation of surplus necessary to sustain both elite households and labor forces. The spatial arrangement of these storage zones, often located near central halls, suggests that the management of food resources played a central role in maintaining political authority. Soil micromorphology within these spaces further reveals patterns of heavy foot traffic, compacted layers, and refuse deposits consistent with continuous activity and the coordination of multiple groups engaged in storage and transport. Beyond the walls of these centers, evidence of organized production landscapes provides additional insights into the mechanisms of Hallstatt power. Surveys around major hill forts show concentrations of smaller workshops specializing in metalwork, textile production, and bone carving. These satellite workshops, often located near river crossings or transport routes, acted as peripheral nodes tied to the economic demands of elite centers. Excavations at such sites reveal loom weights, spindle whorls, and dyeing vats, material indicators of textile production on a scale exceeding domestic needs. Analyses of plant remains from these contexts identify flax and other fiber-producing species cultivated specifically for textile use, suggesting organized agricultural regimes aligned with craft industries. This integration of agricultural production and specialized craftwork demonstrates the systematic coordination characteristic of Hallstatt polities. The ideological dimension of Hallstatt power is articulated most clearly through ceremonial architecture and ritual deposition. At sites like the Glauberg, monumental earthworks encircle burial mounds associated with elite figures. The famous statue discovered there, depicting a warrior adorned with a leaf-shaped headdress, offers rare iconographic evidence of how elites fashion their public identities. The statue's detailed representation of armor, clothing, and ornamentation corresponds closely with artifacts found in nearby burials, reinforcing the connection between symbolic imagery and material practice. Ritual pits located around these monuments contain offerings of weapons, tools, and animal remains arranged with deliberate order, indicating ceremonial activities designed to bind community identity to specific lineages. Radiocarbon dates from these pits align with major construction phases at the site, pointing to coordinated ritual programs embedded within the political life of the community. Environmental evidence further underscores the expanding reach of Hallstatt elites. Pollen sequences from wetlands near fortified centers show increased indicators of woodland clearance, cereal cultivation, and pasture expansion. These changes reflect not only population growth, but also the demands of supporting elite households, producing surplus for trade, and sustaining large-scale ritual events. In some regions, sediment cores reveal elevated charcoal concentrations, signaling periodic burning associated with land management. Such patterns point to deliberate environmental engineering, where elites reshaped local ecologies to support their economic and political systems. Conceptually, the Hallstatt ascendancy represents the crystallization of a social order in which long-distance exchange, internal hierarchy, and ritual performance were mutually reinforcing. Authority depended on networks that extended far beyond local landscapes, yet its legitimacy was grounded in practices that emphasized continuity, lineage, and communal participation. The capacity to mediate between these spheres, local memory and distant connection, define the role of Hallstatt elites and set the ideological framework for the societies that followed. As the 6th century gave way to the 5th, signs of transition began to appear. Some elite centers continued to prosper, but others show evidence of contraction or abandonment. Shifts in burial practices, weapon forms, and artistic motifs hint at emerging cultural patterns that would eventually define the Latine horizon. The archaeological record from this period captures a world on the brink of transformation, where established structures persisted even as new influences began to reshape cultural identities across Western Europe. The next phase of development would bring changes in art, warfare, mobility, and political organization, changes that would form the basis for the societies later recognized as the Gauls. By the early 5th century BC, the cultural landscape of Central and Western Europe began to shift in ways that signaled the emergence of a new aesthetic, technological, and social horizon. This transformation, known as the Latine phenomenon, unfolded not through sudden disruption, but through a gradual layering of innovations within the long-established frameworks of Hallstatt society. Archaeological deposits along lake shores in Switzerland, particularly at Latine itself, provide some of the clearest anchors for this transition. Waterlogged conditions preserved an array of weapons, scabbards, fibulae, and fittings whose curvilinear motifs, spirals, tendrils, and elongated S-forms mark a break from the geometric austerity of earlier designs. The precision of these patterns, carved into bronze or iron surfaces with controlled strokes, suggests a conceptual shift in craftsmanship. Ornamentation no longer served primarily as a symbol of hierarchy, but as a medium of cultural expression tied to shifting identities. Meanwhile, weapon assemblages from these lakeside deposits reveal advances in metallurgy and changes in martial practice. Iron swords became slimmer and more responsive, often paired with scabbards constructed from thin iron plates riveted to organic backings. Stratigraphic layers indicate repeated deposition events, some associated with broken or deliberately bent weapons. This pattern suggests ritualized offerings rather than battlefield refuse, pointing to a cultural context in which martial equipment held symbolic value that extended beyond combat. The presence of spearheads, shield bosses, and chariot fittings deposited in water further reinforces the significance of ritual performance during this period. These objects, preserved in anaerobic sediments, offer rare insight into the evolving relationship between warfare, spirituality, and social cohesion. The expansion of mobility across the European landscape forms another defining feature of the Latine transformation. Archaeological evidence from regions as distant as northern Italy, Bohemia, and the Carpathian Basin reveals material culture closely aligned with that found in Western Latine heartlands. Fibula types, weapon forms, and ceramic styles display remarkable similarities despite considerable distance. Such patterns indicate not uniformity, but widespread interaction facilitated by increasingly effective transportation systems. Wagon technology improved through the adoption of more durable iron components, visible in the standardization of linchpins and wheel rims. Roadway surveys across river valleys in eastern France show rutted tracks whose deep impressions suggest regular passage of heavy vehicles. These routes connected hill forts, rural settlements, and trade nodes, forming corridors along which goods, information, and people traveled with expanding frequency. The mobility of people during this period contributed to demographic shifts that can be traced through burial evidence. In several regions, necropolises exhibit mixed assemblages, combining local traditions with artifacts from distant cultural spheres. At sites in Bohemia, for example, Latin-style sword burials appear alongside pottery forms typically associated with eastern Alpine regions. Radiocarbon sequences from these cemeteries cluster within narrow timeframes, indicating episodes of coordinated interment that may reflect migratory movements or the integration of newcomers into existing communities. Osteological studies from these burials show varied dietary signatures, suggesting individuals originated from different ecological zones before settling in shared landscapes. These patterns demonstrate that Latin society was shaped by networks of mobility that extended far beyond local territories. Artistic innovation, technological development, and increased movement across regions coincided with changes in settlement organization. At several major sites, including Manching in Bavaria, the earliest phases of what would later become Oppida, large fortified proto-urban centers, began to appear. Excavations reveal broad enclosure ditches, rectilinear street layouts, and evidence of specialized craft production. Although these settlements did not yet exhibit the scale of their later forms, their spatial coherence and concentration of activity suggest emerging forms of regional integration. Soil chemistry within craft districts identifies metal residues, ceramic wasters, and organic traces that map the distribution of production activities. These analytical signatures demonstrate that communities reorganized their economic systems to support concentrated populations and expanded craft specialization. Conceptually, the Latin transformation represents a shift toward a more fluid cultural environment where identity was negotiated through artistic expression, long-distance interaction, and new forms of martial display. The curvilinear ornamentation that defines the period reflects not only aesthetic change, but also an evolving symbolic language tied to perceptions of movement, continuity, and power. This stylistic vocabulary, carried across regions through mobility and exchange, became a shared framework through which diverse communities articulated their place within a broader cultural system. As the 5th century progressed, the interplay between artistic innovation, technological refinement, and long-distance mobility deepened, producing a cultural momentum that reshaped the political and social landscape of Iron Age Europe. From this confluence emerged new forms of warrior identity, expanded trade routes, and increasingly interconnected societies, developments that would set the foundation for the distinctive world of the Gauls in the centuries to come. As the 5th century BC advanced, the Latin cultural horizon expanded across Western and Central Europe in patterns that reflect both continuity with earlier Hallstatt structures and innovations born from shifting political and economic conditions. One of the clearest indicators of this transition lies in the changing character of weaponry. Excavations at riverine deposition sites such as Latin and Port Julian reveal swords with elongated blades and midrib reinforcements, designed for slashing rather than thrusting. Metallurgical analyses show carbon-rich iron produced through increasingly controlled smelting techniques, suggesting improvements in furnace design and refined selection of ore sources. The presence of scabbards decorated with repoussé motifs and inlaid fittings indicates that weapons function not merely as tools of combat, but as markers of social status displayed in both life and ritualized contexts. Stratigraphic layers from these wetland sites demonstrate repeated offerings, with broken or bent swords laid carefully alongside shield fragments and spearheads, suggesting ceremonial practices tied to communal identity. Parallel developments can be observed in the realm of horsemanship and chariotry. Bit fittings and harness elements recovered from burial contexts display standardized forms crafted with technical precision. At sites in Champagne and the Upper Rhine, paired horse burials appear alongside warrior interments, accompanied by wheel components and chariot fittings, whose iron rivets and wooden impressions provide insights into construction methods. These burials, aligned with solar or landscape features, reflect a martial ideology that integrated mobility, prestige, and ritual performance. Osteological studies of horses from these contexts reveal selective breeding for strength and agility, suggesting an investment in equine management that supported both warfare and ceremonial display. Meanwhile, artistic conventions underwent further evolution through the integration of Mediterranean influences. Contact with Greek and Etruscan traders introduced new visual vocabularies that artisans adapted to local forms. Excavations at sites near the Rhone corridor have uncovered bronze vessels decorated with hybrid motifs, combining geometric Greek patterns with the flowing curves characteristic of Latin art. Residue analysis on some of these vessels indicates their use in feasting rituals involving wine mixed with aromatic herbs, a practice that blended imported ceremonial traditions with local social structures. The controlled adoption of Mediterranean elements demonstrates that Latin communities were selective in their engagements, integrating external influences into an aesthetic system that remained distinctly their own. Changes in settlement organization mirror these artistic and technological transformations. At Manching, early phases of construction reveal planned street grids organized around central open spaces, where archaeological evidence identifies craft workshops, storage facilities, and meeting areas. Soil chemistry mapping within these zones indicates concentrations of phosphate and metal residues, marking intensive human activity across multiple craft sectors. Such spatial arrangements demonstrate a shift toward more complex settlement planning, where production, trade, and governance were integrated within expanding urban-like centers. Remote sensing surveys reveal networks of ditches, embankments, and palisades that enclosed large areas, reflecting both defensive concerns and administrative organization. These emerging centers acted as focal points for increasingly specialized economic systems. Textile production became more advanced, with spindle whorls, loom weights, and dyeing vats found in concentrated clusters within craft districts. Analyses of textile fragments demonstrate the use of fine wool and plant fibers dyed with pigments derived from madder, weld, and other botanical sources. The production of cloth on such a scale suggests involvement in long-distance trade, with finished textiles moving along the same corridors that carried metalwork, ceramics, and prestige goods. Similarly, glass production, visible in the form of beads and small ornaments, emerged as a distinctive craft, with compositional analyses identifying consistent recipes across wide regions. Conceptually, these developments reflect a society increasingly defined by movement of people, goods, styles, and ideas. The fluidity of Latin art, with its dynamic curves and flowing lines, mirrors the mobility evident in the archaeological record. This aesthetic expression captures the psychological dimension of a world where identities were shaped through interaction across distances, where communities situated themselves within networks that extended far beyond their immediate landscapes. In this sense, Latin culture was not a static tradition, but a continually negotiated framework through which societies articulated their place in a changing world. As the 5th century drew to a close, the simultaneous expansion of trade networks, the refinement of martial technologies, and the emergence of proto-urban settlements created new conditions for political organization. These developments formed the structural base upon which later tribal confederations would emerge, giving rise to the complex societies encountered by Mediterranean observers and eventually by Rome itself. The next phase of this transformation would be marked by increasing social stratification, intensifying regional interaction, and the early outlines of the tribal polities that would dominate the landscape of Iron Age Gaul. By the 4th century BC, the momentum of Latin cultural development produced a landscape marked by increasingly complex patterns of interaction. where technological refinement, symbolic expression, and social organization intertwined across vast distances. One of the most revealing indicators of this complexity lies in the distribution of coinage. Although early coin forms appear unevenly across regions, numismatic evidence from the Seine Basin, the Marne, and parts of Bohemia shows communities adopting struck or cast metal tokens whose iconography blends Greek prototypes with distinctly local motifs. Metallurgical assays reveal consistent alloy compositions within specific zones, indicating controlled production overseen by emerging authorities. The circulation of these coins, found in river hoards, marketplaces, and hillfort contexts, reflects the rise of economic systems more standardized than those of earlier periods, enabling exchanges that connected craft specialists, pastoralists, and foreign traders into shared value networks. The expansion of exchange systems is also visible through the distribution of iron production centers. Excavations in the Ardennes and the Jura Mountains reveal charcoal-rich slag heaps and furnace remains that document large-scale smelting operations. Radiocarbon sequences place these activities within narrow timeframes, demonstrating that production reached industrial levels capable of supplying regional demand for tools and weaponry. These centers relied on coordinated labor, woodcutters managing forest stands for charcoal, miners extracting ore from shallow pits, and smiths refining blooms into usable iron bars. The debris fields surrounding these sites, dense with hammer scales and furnace fragments, form archaeological signatures of sustained metallurgical economies. This increase in iron availability transformed agricultural practices, enabling communities to expand plow agriculture and maintain larger herds, thereby supporting the demographic growth detected in settlement patterns. The demographic expansion of this era manifests clearly in the proliferation of rural settlements surrounding major hillforts. Field surveys across Burgundy and the Upper Rhine Valley show dense clusters of farmsteads arranged along terrace edges and watercourses. Soil profiles within their fields reveal deep plow marks, indicating repeated cultivation over multiple generations. Botanical remains from granaries show increased reliance on millet and barley, complemented by legumes that improved soil fertility. This agricultural diversity, combined with iron tools and managed livestock, underpinned the economic resilience of Latin communities. At the same time, rural households participated in exchange networks by producing surplus crafts, especially textiles and ceramics, destined for distribution through expanding proto-urban centers. These centers, often enclosed by timber-laced ramparts and deep ditches, functioned as administrative and economic nodes. Excavations at sites such as Titelberg and Burges demonstrate complex internal zoning, where metalworking, pottery firing, grain storage, and public gathering spaces were organized with a level of planning that reflects emerging institutional structures. Soil chemistry mapping within these enclosures highlights zones of intensive activity, elevated traces of copper and tin marking bronze workshops, high phosphate concentrations indicating areas of livestock processing, and dense accumulations of waster fragments identifying kilns operating at full capacity. These material signatures point to a society increasingly familiar with the demands of coordinated production and collective governance. Ritual life expanded in parallel, shaping social cohesion and the ideological framework of emerging polities. Sanctuaries at sites like Gournay-sur-Aronde and Riedmont-sur-Anker preserve layers of weapon deposits, animal remains, and post-string structures indicative of regular ceremonial activities. Thousands of spearheads, sword fragments, and shields were deliberately damaged before deposition, suggesting ritualized neutralization intended to remove the martial potency of weapons before offering them to the divine. Animal bones, particularly from cattle and horses, bear cut marks consistent with ceremonial butchery, while spatial distributions of remains indicate these acts occurred in defined enclosures. Stratigraphic data show repeated use of these sanctuaries over centuries, reinforcing their role as focal points of collective memory and political legitimacy. Conceptually, the interplay between ritual, warfare, and governance reveals a society negotiating identity through both material display and shared symbolic frameworks. The deposition of weapons in sacred enclosures, the embellishment of scabbards with flowing patterns, and the construction of fortified centers express interconnected ideas about power, mobility, and belonging. In this environment, the distinction between economic, political, and ritual spheres became increasingly porous, with each domain reinforcing the authority of emerging elites whose influence depended on their ability to mediate between local communities and broader cultural networks. By the later 4th century BC, the cumulative impact of these developments had generated a new social architecture across Western Europe. Communities linked by shared artistic vocabularies, long-distance alliances, and coordinated economic systems began to form larger political structures whose outlines would later be recognized as the tribes of Gaul. Their leaders commanded loyalty through feasting, warfare, trade, and ritual performance, creating polities that combined local foundations with regional aspirations. These rising tribal formations, shaped by Latin mobility and the material expressions that accompanied it, would soon evolve into the complex political entities that define the world encountered by Mediterranean observers in the centuries to come, setting the stage for the intricate governance systems, fortified oppida, and shifting alliances that characterized the next chapter of Gaulish development. By the 3rd century BC, the landscape of Western Europe revealed settlement patterns marked by unprecedented scale and internal coordination. The communities that classical authors would later describe as the Gauls had begun forming political structures rooted in both inherited Latin traditions and emerging needs for regional governance. Archaeological evidence across the Seine basin, Burgundy, and the Auvergne shows the appearance of large fortified centers, oppida, whose complexity signaled a new phase of social organization. These settlements, often perched on plateaus or enclosed within river bends, encompassed dozens of hectares and incorporated defensive works combining earth, timber, and stone. Excavations at sites such as Bibracte and Manching reveal fortification systems using the Murus Gallicus technique, horizontal timbers locked into stone facings with iron spikes. Radiocarbon sequences place the construction of these walls within tight chronological windows, indicating coordinated labor mobilized by central authorities rather than dispersed community efforts. Within these oppida, the spatial layout reflects administrative intent. Streets arranged along planned axes intersect with zones dedicated to specific economic activities. Soil chemistry mapping at Manching identifies areas dense with iron residues, marking blacksmith quarters where tools, weapons, and fittings were forged in quantities far exceeding household demand. Similarly, clusters of spindle whorls, loom weights, and dyed textile fragments point to localized textile districts operating at near-industrial scale. Ceramic kilns found within defined workshops show standardized firing techniques and controlled temperatures, producing large batches of vessels used for storage, transport, and domestic consumption. These production zones were complemented by wide open spaces interpreted as marketplaces, where imported goods, amphorae, bronze vessels, and glass ornaments appear in concentrated layers. Such distributions suggest that oppida functioned as regional hubs, where economic, political, and social activities converged under emerging tribal authorities. Rural landscapes surrounding these centers also evolved in response to their influence. Field systems identified through aerial photography and ground surveys form rectilinear patterns aligned with major oppida, indicating coordinated land division. Pollen sequences from valley floors show intensified cereal production, with marked increases in barley and millet alongside evidence of expanded grazing areas. These environmental signatures reflect the demands of supplying large population centers where grain, livestock, and raw materials were consumed at high rates. Excavations of farmsteads nearby Bibracte reveal substantial storage facilities, including granaries raised on post platforms to protect against moisture and pests. The presence of imported goods in these rural contexts suggests that even households distant from major oppida participated in exchange systems, reinforcing regional integration. Economic networks extended across considerable distances, linking interior Gaul to coastal and riverine trade routes. Numismatic evidence indicates the spread of coinage issued by various tribes, each mint producing distinctive iconographic motifs, stylized horses, abstracted heads, and geometric patterns. Metallurgical analyses reveal consistent weights and alloy compositions within specific political zones, demonstrating efforts to regulate economic exchange. These coins appear not only in marketplaces, but also in ritual deposits and domestic contexts, suggesting that monetary systems had permeated multiple layers of Gaulish society. The spatial distribution of coin hoards aligns with major trade corridors traced through amphora finds, revealing active exchange between Gaulish communities and Mediterranean merchants transporting wine, oil, and luxury goods along the Rhône and Garonne rivers. Governance within these emerging tribal polities functioned through a blend of tradition and innovation. Classical sources describe councils of nobles, magistrates chosen annually, and assemblies capable of coordinating collective action. Archaeology provides material correlates for these institutions. Large meeting enclosures at sites such as Corinth feature structured seating arrangements, central hearths, and layers of refuse indicating repeated communal gatherings. Radiocarbon data shows that these enclosures were used over extended periods, suggesting stable political institutions rather than temporary assemblies. The concentration of weapons, tools, and ritual offerings in adjacent pits indicates that political proceedings were interwoven with ceremonial acts, reinforcing authority through displays of both martial readiness and religious legitimacy. Conceptually, the rise of these tribal governance systems represents the culmination of centuries of cultural development grounded in Latin mobility, Hallstatt hierarchy, and long-distance interaction. The oppida served as focal points where economic management, political negotiation, and communal identity converged, forming the structural base from which later Gaulish polities operated. These centers were not early cities in the Mediterranean sense, but they embodied a form of proto-urbanism shaped by local traditions, economic necessity, and the symbolic power of fortified landscapes. As the 3rd century progressed, the political structures emerging within these oppida began to influence broader networks of alliances, rivalries, and territorial ambitions. These dynamics would shape the contours of tribal Gaul, setting the stage for intensified interregional competition and the growing prominence of leaders who could mobilize warriors, coordinate trade, and maintain relationships with neighboring communities. From this evolving system emerged the recognizable framework of Gaulish governance that would soon dominate the historical landscape. Across the expanding tribal landscape of 3rd century Gaul, patterns of governance and economic coordination began to crystallize in ways that reveal increasingly formalized political structures. Excavations at multiple oppida provide some of the clearest material indicators of this shift. At Bibracte, the internal organization of habitation zones shows carefully arranged domestic compounds constructed with standardized timber framing techniques. Soil micromorphology within these compounds reveals hearths, storage pits, and waste disposal areas positioned with consistent spacing, suggesting architectural norms transmitted across the community. Meanwhile, water management features, wood-lined wells, drainage ditches, and paved pathways demonstrate systematic planning intended to accommodate dense populations and the movement of goods. These infrastructural signatures indicate that the oppidum was not merely a defensive refuge, but a functioning civic center where administration, production, and ritual activity intersected. The political dynamics reflected in these settlements are further supported by evidence from large meeting plazas discovered at several sites. At Corinth, extensive excavations have uncovered a central square bordered by timber-framed buildings and ceremonial enclosures. Stratigraphic layers within the plaza contain dense accumulations of pottery, animal bones, and metal objects, refuse from repeated gatherings where feasting, deliberation, and ritual performance occurred together. Radiocarbon dates show continuity of use across multiple generations, suggesting established political rhythms tied to seasonal cycles. The presence of amphora fragments, some bearing inscriptions from Mediterranean workshops, indicates that imported wine played a role in elite negotiations and communal events. These gatherings likely served as mechanisms for resolving disputes, forming alliances, and reaffirming the authority of magistrates or noble councils. Evidence from weapon deposits and specialized martial zones provides additional insight into governance structures. At Gergovia and other major centers, archaeologists have uncovered concentrations of spearheads, shield fittings, and sword fragments deposited in shallow pits peripheral to habitation zones. Many of these weapons display deliberate breakage, a pattern associated with ritualized neutralization rather than practical disposal. The proximity of such deposits to meeting spaces implies that martial symbolism formed part of political expression, where leaders demonstrated their capacity to protect tribal territories and uphold communal obligations. Classical sources, though filtered through external perspectives, describe assemblies where warriors pledged loyalty or debated military ventures, and these accounts align with the material evidence of integrated political martial culture. Beyond the Oppida, rural landscapes reveal agricultural systems increasingly tied to centralized authority. Field surveys across the Seine and Loire regions show networks of enclosed farmsteads organized around rectilinear parcels. These enclosures, defined by ditches and low banks, correspond to field systems that remained in use for extended periods. The spatial coherence of these farms, often aligned with trackways leading toward major oppida, suggests that agricultural production operated within a framework of regional coordination. Botanical remains from granaries indicate steady increases in barley, spelt, and millet cultivation, while faunal assemblages show growing reliance on cattle and pigs. Such patterns reflect surplus production capable of sustaining large populations and supporting political structures reliant on tribute, feasting, and warfare. Trade networks also intensified during this period. At Lattes, on the Mediterranean coast, stratigraphic layers contain dense concentrations of Gaulish pottery and coinage, alongside imported amphorae, iron bars, and glass beads. The presence of standardized Gaulish coin types in these layers indicates sustained economic relationships linking inland tribes to coastal emporia. Metallurgical analyses of coin hoards from the Rhone corridor reveal consistent alloy compositions across wide regions, suggesting cooperative efforts among tribal authorities to regulate currency and maintain predictable exchange systems. This monetary coherence facilitated long-distance trade in salt, textiles, metalwork, livestock, and crafted ornaments. In this environment, elite households within Oppida likely served as intermediaries, managing trade routes and negotiating access to foreign markets. Ritual practices embedded within these economic and political systems provide additional texture to Gaulish governance. Sanctuaries located near major oppida show patterns of offering deposition that align with communal cycles of decision-making and seasonal festivals. At Gournay-sur-Aronde, repeated layers of animal bones, primarily from cattle, bear cut marks consistent with structured butchery, indicating that feasting formed part of ritual events conducted at regular intervals. The deposition of weapons and tools in these sanctuaries reflects ideological frameworks where martial identity, agricultural prosperity, and spiritual legitimacy converged. Such practices tied political authority to both divine sanction and collective participation. Conceptually, the Gaulish governance system that emerged from these processes reflects a model where power was distributed across multiple institutions rather than centralized in a single ruler. Councils, magistrates, warrior elites, and ritual specialists operated within a shared framework grounded in material practice. Their authority relied on their capacity to mobilize labor, manage regional resources, and articulate communal identity through ritual and spatial design. As the 2nd century BC approached, these tribal structures became increasingly intertwined with broader regional dynamics, shaping alliances, rivalries, and territorial claims that would define the political landscape confronting external powers. The evolving complexity of settlement planning, economic systems, and ritual governance marked Gaul as a mosaic of interconnected communities whose organizational strength would soon be tested by growing pressures both within and beyond their borders. By the later 3rd and early 2nd centuries BC, the social and political architecture of Gaul had evolved into a network of tribal polities, whose internal cohesion and external relations can be reconstructed through settlement archaeology, numismatic patterns, and the structured deposition of material culture. Across major regions, evidence of coordinated territorial management becomes increasingly visible. Linear earthworks, preserved as shallow banks or faint ditches, extend across ridgelines and valley floors in the Auvergne and Champagne. Although their precise functions vary, stratigraphic investigations indicate phases of construction aligned with shifts in regional power, suggesting their use as territorial markers, livestock control systems, or boundary lines negotiated between tribes. Their presence, combined with fortified oppida positioned at strategic nodes, reflects a political landscape defined by both cooperation and competition. This complexity is further illustrated by the clustering of specialized production sites around tribal centers. At a chiromance in the Ardennes, excavations reveal an open settlement organized into sectors devoted to distinct activities: animal husbandry, metalwork, textile production, and ritual practice. Radiocarbon sequences show that these sectors operated concurrently rather than sequentially, indicating an integrated community whose functions supported broader regional structures. Archaeobotanical analyses identify emmer, barley, and flax cultivated in surrounding fields, while faunal remains point to mixed herding strategies with cattle, sheep, and pigs raised in balanced proportions. These economic signatures suggest that such settlements contributed not only to local sustenance, but also to the provisioning of oppida, where political leadership and high-demand craft industries were concentrated. Patterns of long-distance interaction broadened during this period, revealing Gauls' growing participation in transregional networks. Amphorae from Italian workshops appear in inland Gaulish contexts with increasing frequency, their distribution concentrated along river arteries such as the Saône and Rhône. Chemical analyses of residues inside these vessels confirm the presence of wine, a commodity that played a crucial role in elite feasting and diplomacy. At the same time, exports of Gaulish products, particularly salt from interior mines, iron bars from metallurgical districts, and finely woven textiles, moved southward toward Mediterranean markets. The expansion of these routes is documented archaeologically by roadside settlements containing mixed material assemblages. Local ceramics intermingled with imported lamps, bronzes, and small personal items that trace the movement of merchants, emissaries, and specialists across tribal boundaries. This period also reveals intensifying forms of social differentiation. Burial evidence across the Marne and Moselle regions demonstrates a renewed emphasis on weapon grave, where swords, spearheads, and shields accompany individuals arranged in extended supine positions. The placement of weapons beside the body, often with scabbards oriented toward the head or left side, suggests codified funerary practices reflecting aristocratic identity. Metallurgical analyses identify high-quality ironwork with patterned hilts, indicating access to skilled craftsmen and specialized production facilities. Yet these martial displays occur alongside more modest burials containing domestic tools, spindle whorls, or simple ceramic offerings, illustrating a society where status was expressed through distinct material vocabularies calibrated to social role and community expectations. Ritual sites associated with these communities further illuminate the ideological frameworks underpinning Gaulish governance. At Riedmont-sur-Ancre, excavations of a large enclosure have revealed thousands of human and animal bones arranged in patterned deposits, including articulated limbs and isolated skulls placed within rectangular ditches. Stratigraphic layers indicate that these offerings occurred during major ceremonial events involving large gatherings. The presence of weapon fragments, deliberately deformed before deposition, aligns with practices documented in earlier sanctuaries, reinforcing the continuity of martial symbolism in both political and religious contexts. Botanical remains from hearths within the enclosure suggest feasting on cattle and pig, accompanied by fermented beverages whose residues remain detectable on pottery sherds. These findings depict rituals that blended community participation, elite display, and spiritual invocation into a unified social performance. Conceptually, the political coherence of Gaul in this period resided not in centralized authority, but in a constellation of tribal institutions capable of coordinating territory, labor, and identity through interlocking economic, martial, and ritual systems. Councils, noble lineages, warrior retinues, and ritual specialists shared overlapping responsibilities, with each group reinforcing the legitimacy of the others. This distributed model allowed for adaptability in the face of shifting alliances and external pressures, while maintaining internal cohesion through shared cultural practices manifested in the architecture of oppida, the circulation of coinage, and the repeated enactment of communal ceremonies. By the close of the 2nd century BC, these interconnected systems had produced a mosaic of robust tribal polities, each distinct in its customs, yet integrated through networks of trade, diplomacy, and shared material culture. The world of tribal Gaul, shaped by centuries of incremental transformation, now stood poised for a period of intensified interaction with the Mediterranean powers, whose economic expansion and military ambitions would soon reshape the political landscape of Western Europe. By the late 6th and early 5th centuries BC, contact between the communities of Gaul and the Mediterranean world intensified through a series of expanding economic, diplomatic, and cultural exchanges. These interactions, though unevenly distributed across regions, produced material signatures that reveal sustained communication between inland tribal societies and maritime centers dominated by Greek, Etruscan, and later Roman merchants. One of the earliest and clearest anchors for this expanding network lies in the colony of Massalia, founded around 600 BC by Greek settlers from Phocaea. Archaeological layers from the site contain amphorae, fine ceramics, and bronze vessels that match stylistic and compositional profiles from workshops in Asia Minor and southern Italy. These imports did not remain confined to the coastal zone. Over the subsequent centuries, they traveled up the Rhone corridor into the interior, where their presence in elite burials and oppida contexts demonstrates their role as symbols of status and instruments of political negotiation. Inland distribution patterns show that imported wine amphorae were among the most widely circulated Mediterranean goods. At Lattes, located along the lower Rhone, stratigraphic sequences contain dense concentrations of Greek and later Etruscan amphorae, some bearing potters' marks and stamped handles that allow precise sourcing. Residue analysis inside certain vessels has detected traces of resonated wine, confirming the movement of perishable commodities across considerable distances. From Lattes, these amphorae traveled northward to sites such as Vix, Bibracte, and Achairomance, where the deposition of foreign vessels in elite contexts indicates their importance in ceremonial feasting. At Vix, the monumental crater discovered in a princely burial demonstrates the scale of Mediterranean influence, its immense size and intricate design representing a level of craftsmanship unfamiliar to local artisans. While its symbolic meaning remains debated, the vessel's presence underscores the willingness of Gaulish elites to incorporate foreign prestige objects into their own systems of authority. The exchange was not one-directional. Archaeological evidence demonstrates that Gaulish products moved south in significant quantities. Salt, mined from deep galleries in eastern France and southwestern Germany, formed the backbone of north-south trade. Excavations at the Hallstatt and Durenberg mines reveal wooden shovels, leather sacks, and preserved torch fragments that attest to highly organized extraction systems capable of producing surpluses beyond local needs. Iron bars, standardized in shape and weight, also traveled south along river corridors. Compositional analyses of bars found in Mediterranean port contexts match ore signatures from interior Gaulish production zones. Additionally, textile fragments preserved in waterlogged conditions show fine weaving and dyeing techniques, suggesting that cloth formed another key export. These materials, essential to Mediterranean markets, position the tribes of Gaul as valuable trading partners whose resources contributed to broader regional economies. Diplomatic implications accompanied these economic networks. Although direct textual evidence from this period is sparse, archaeological correlates suggest the presence of emissaries, brokers, and intermediaries facilitating communication. At several sites in the Rhone Valley, small caches of imported luxury goods, bronze mirrors, carved ivories, and ornate fibulae appear in domestic settings rather than elite burials, suggesting their distribution through negotiated relationships rather than strictly ceremonial exchange. The recurrence of certain artifact types, such as Massilliote ceremonial cups, indicates standardized forms of diplomatic gifting. These objects circulated along established pathways, creating shared cultural touchpoints that linked distant communities through material familiarity. Technological and stylistic influences further illustrate the depth of these interactions. Pottery workshops in Gaul began adopting wheel-throwing techniques derived from Mediterranean practices, evident in ceramic assemblages featuring sharper rims and more regular vessel profiles. Metallurgical studies show that certain forging and alloying traditions migrated northward, reflected in the increased presence of bronze basins and cauldrons with Etruscan stylistic features. Artistic motifs such as palmettes, lotus flowers, and geometric meanders appear on locally produced bronze fittings, integrated into Latin curvilinear styles rather than replacing them. This selective adaptation demonstrates that Gaulish communities incorporated external influences into local idioms, reinforcing rather than diminishing cultural identity. Conceptually, the rise of Mediterranean contact represents a shift in the social logic of prestige and authority in Gaul. Elite households, already positioned at the center of regional networks, now embedded their legitimacy in the ability to acquire, display, and redistribute foreign luxuries. These goods, carrying symbolic weight derived from distant origins, allowed leaders to articulate their roles not only as stewards of local tradition, but as intermediaries connected to broader worlds. In this sense, Mediterranean trade reshaped Gaulish political culture by embedding external relationships within internal hierarchies. By the 5th century BC, these interactions had become woven into the fabric of Gaulish life, influencing not only elite display, but also settlement patterns, craft specialization, and regional diplomacy. This expanding sphere of contact formed the foundation for increasingly complex alliances and rivalries, setting the stage for the deeper transformations that would emerge as Gaul continued its engagement with the Mediterranean world. As Mediterranean contact deepened through the 4th and 3rd centuries BC, Gaulish societies underwent notable internal transformations driven not by imitation, but by selective adaptation. Archaeological sequences across the Rhone Basin and eastern Languedoc reveal settlements reorganizing their spatial layouts to accommodate increasing volumes of imported goods. At sites such as Latara, modern Lattes, excavations have identified waterfront warehouses built with stone socles and timber superstructures, their floors hardened by repeated compaction from amphora storage. Soil chemistry analyses show elevated levels of tartrate salts, a chemical signature formed when wine residues seep into substrate over extended periods. These findings attest to the scale of wine handling at these ports, where amphorae from Massalia, Etruria, and later Campania converged before entering inland networks. The architectural investment in storage and redistribution infrastructure indicates deliberate planning designed to integrate Mediterranean commodities into local economies. Further inland, Oppida show evidence of adapting their production systems in response to imported goods. At Bibracte, workshops near the central plateau contain ceramic wasters demonstrating experimentation with new vessel shapes modeled on Mediterranean prototypes. Although the majority of Gaulish ceramics remained locally distinctive, certain forms, such as wide-rimmed bowls and amphora-like storage jars, adopted proportions influenced by Greek and Italic designs. Petrographic analysis confirms that these were produced using native clay beds, but with kiln temperatures more precisely controlled, suggesting the adoption of firing techniques observed through long-distance interaction. Metallurgical workshops similarly incorporated new styling elements. Bronze basins bearing motifs echoing Etruscan repoussé work appear in ritual and domestic contexts, blending external aesthetics with Latin curvilinear forms. These material adaptations correspond to shifting patterns in social display and consumption. Feasting practices, long central to Gaulish political culture, increasingly incorporated imported wine and foreign vessels. Residue analysis on cups and flagons found in elite compounds shows mixtures of wine with local herbs, honey, and sometimes barley infusions, producing beverages that merged Mediterranean drinking customs with indigenous culinary traditions. The spatial distribution of such finds, concentrated in compounds associated with high-status households, illustrates that control over foreign commodities functioned as a mechanism for asserting leadership within tribal communities. The acquisition and redistribution of imported goods became part of the political economy of power, where alliances were reinforced through shared consumption and the performance of hospitality. At the same time, evidence from rural settlements reveals that the impacts of Mediterranean exchange extended beyond elites. Amphora sherds found in village contexts near the Saône and Loire indicate that wine occasionally circulated into non-elite households, though in smaller quantities. More significant for rural communities was the diffusion of new technologies and craft traditions. Wheel-thrown pottery appeared in modest quantities at smaller farmsteads, suggesting itinerant artisans or apprentices carried techniques across social boundaries. Likewise, iron tools, axes, adzes, and pruning knives, produced using improved forging methods, became increasingly common in rural assemblages. Compositional studies of these tools link their production to specialized smithing districts within oppida, implying distribution systems that moved goods outward to dependent agricultural communities. Trading relationships also reconfigured patterns of mobility and communication. Pathways connecting the Rhône Valley to the Seine and Moselle regions bear archaeological traces of intensified use. Compacted soils, layered gravel surfaces, and repeated rut impressions marking the passage of heavy wagons. Along these routes, small roadside settlements developed, each containing mixed assemblages of local and imported goods. One such site near Chalon-sur-Saône contains stratified layers of Gaulish coinage, artisanal debris, and fragments of Greek drinking vessels, suggesting that merchants, artisans, and tribal emissaries used these stops as intermediary nodes within wider exchange systems. Radiocarbon dates align these layers with periods of increased amphora distribution, indicating synchronized activity across transportation corridors. These economic networks shaped political relationships in subtle but measurable ways. Certain tribes, particularly those controlling river access or key land routes, gained disproportionate influence within regional alliances. Numismatic evidence reflects this shift. Distinctive coin types associated with the Aedui, Arvani, and Helvetii appear in wide circulation, indicating their roles as major participants in long-distance trade. The imagery on these coins blends local symbols with abstract motifs, possibly influenced by Mediterranean iconography, demonstrating how political identity became intertwined with external contact. In some regions, the concentration of coin hoards suggests periods of instability or strategic consolidation, reflecting the fluctuating dynamics of intertribal competition sharpened by the economic stakes of Mediterranean commerce. Conceptually, the expansion of these networks reveals the evolving nature of Gaulish society as one capable of absorbing external influences while reinforcing internal structures. The presence of foreign goods did not erode local identity. Instead, it provided new materials through which communities articulated power, affiliation, and cultural continuity. The selective adoption of external practices, whether in craft techniques, drinking rituals, or symbolic imagery, demonstrates a form of cultural negotiation rooted in long-standing traditions of mobility and adaptability. By the 3rd century BC, these interactions had woven Gaul into the fabric of a broader economic world, positioning its tribes as both beneficiaries and shapers of transregional exchange. This evolving relationship with the Mediterranean would soon acquire new dimensions through intensified diplomacy, shifting alliances, and encounters with expanding powers, whose ambitions reached increasingly deep into continental Europe. By the early 2nd century BC, the accumulation of Mediterranean influences within Gaulish societies had reached a level of integration discernible not only in the circulation of luxury goods, but also in the rhythms of daily life, political negotiation, and collective identity. Archaeological layers across the Rhône and Garonne corridors show intensifying specialization in trade infrastructure, with expanded warehouse districts, paved quays, and standardized storage facilities forming the connective tissue between coastal emporia and inland polities. These installations, marked by thick sequences of ceramic sherds, amphora stoppers, and carbonized seeds, indicate constant movement of goods, people, and information. Soil chemistry from these zones reveals accumulations of organic residues linked to olive oil, wine, and fermented grain products, offering a detailed picture of commodities that circulated through Gaulish markets. Inland Oppida adapted their physical layouts to accommodate this growing volume of exchange. At Bibracte, recent excavations have documented the expansion of its central plateau, where new terraces were cut into the slopes to support storage buildings with stone foundations and raised wooden floors. Stratigraphic analysis identifies phases of construction corresponding with increases in Mediterranean imports, suggesting responsive planning by governing authorities. These buildings, designed to safeguard goods from moisture and seasonal weather, reflect administrative foresight and the consolidation of roles responsible for regulating trade. Archaeobotanical remains from these terraces, barley husks, grape pips, and exotic seeds, indicate the presence of both local and imported foodstuffs, implying mixed consumption patterns reinforced by material availability. The influence of Mediterranean consumption practices is particularly evident in changes to ritual life. At sanctuaries near major trade routes, such as Gournay-sur-Aronde, excavations reveal shifts in the types of offerings deposited over time. Alongside the traditional deposition of weapons and animal remains, archaeologists have found fragments of imported pottery, amphora shards, and small bronze vessels decorated with hybrid motifs. Their placement within ritual enclosures suggests a symbolic integration of foreign objects into local ceremonial systems. Such objects, incorporated into feasting or sacrificial events, reflect an expanding ideological vocabulary in which external materials carried meanings shaped by both origin and ritual context. Radiocarbon dating of these layers indicates that these practices coincided with periods of heightened intertribal diplomacy and exchange. Diplomatic relationships themselves leave indirect signatures in the archaeological record. At sites where multiple tribes interacted, particularly along the Loire and Garonne river systems, artifact assemblages exhibit striking heterogeneity. Pottery styles from distant regions appear intermixed within single occupation layers, while numismatic evidence shows overlapping circulation of coin types associated with different polities. These patterns imply gatherings where elites negotiated alliances, coordinated resource distribution, or resolved disputes. Classical sources, though written centuries later, suggest that such intertribal meetings involved not only political deliberation, but also competitive feasting and ritual exchanges. Archaeological correlates, including feasting debris found in meeting enclosures at Corinth and Achiromantes, support the idea that diplomacy was enacted as much through material performance as through formal decision-making. These evolving relationships shaped broader political dynamics within Gaul. Tribes positioned along major trade arteries, such as the Aedui along the Saône or the Arvani in the Massif Central, acquired strategic advantages due to their control over key transit routes. Their growing prominence is reflected in the distribution of their coinage, which appears in contexts far beyond their immediate territories. Metallurgical analyses show these coins were produced with consistent weight standards and alloy compositions, indicating organized minting operations likely overseen by governing councils or elite lineages. The widespread appearance of these coin types suggests that certain tribes achieved regional influence by managing exchange networks that linked the Mediterranean world with central Gaulish polities. Conceptually, the integration of Mediterranean goods and practices into Gaulish society reflects a deeper process of cultural negotiation in which external influences were filtered through existing social structures. The adoption of wheel-thrown pottery, improved metallurgical techniques, and new feasting rituals did not represent shifts in identity, but rather expansions in the material repertoire available for expressing status, authority, and collective belonging. These imported forms became embedded in Gaulish traditions, reinforcing rather than displacing local cultural patterns. By the close of the 2nd century BC, the interplay between external contact and internal development had created a complex political landscape shaped by intricate alliances, expanding trade networks, and intensified competition among powerful tribes. This environment, enriched by Mediterranean influence, yet firmly grounded in indigenous traditions, set the stage for the crises and consolidations that would unfold in the decades immediately preceding Roman intervention. The next phase of Gaulish history would be defined not by steady exchange, but by conflict, negotiation, and the rising tensions that preceded the Gallic Wars. By the middle of the 2nd century BC, the political landscape of Gaul entered a period marked by rising internal tensions, expanding regional alliances, and increasing exposure to the geopolitical currents radiating from the Mediterranean world. Archaeological and textual evidence converge to depict a society navigating pressures on multiple fronts: demographic growth, intensifying trade, shifting ecological conditions, and the emergence of rival tribal power blocs whose ambitions occasionally outpaced the mechanisms designed to regulate them. In settlement layers at Bibracte, Gergovia, and multiple oppida along the Seine and Loire corridors, signs of rapid reconstruction, burn layers overlain by compacted habitation deposits, suggest intermittent conflicts that reshaped political boundaries and challenged traditional modes of governance. These episodes, visible in charcoal concentrations, collapsed wall sections, and abandoned storage pits, indicate not widespread devastation, but targeted engagements characteristic of intertribal rivalry. One axis of competition centered on control of trade routes linking the interior to Mediterranean markets. The Aedui, whose territory straddled the Saône-Rhône corridor, appear to have leveraged their strategic position to consolidate influence. Numismatic patterns support this interpretation. Aeduan coinage, identifiable through distinctive stylized equestrian motifs, is found in significant density across central Gaul, particularly in market zones and roadside settlements. Metallurgical analyses reveal consistent alloy compositions within these issues, pointing to regulated production overseen by centralized authorities. Concurrently, archaeological deposits from feasting enclosures associated with Aeduan settlements contain unusually high proportions of amphora fragments, some bearing inscriptions from Massaliote workshops. Such concentrations imply preferential access to imported commodities, reinforcing the Aedui's capacity to maintain alliances through material generosity and ritual display. Opposing this rising power were the Arverni, whose homeland in the Massif Central granted them control over upland pastoral regions and routes connecting the Loire Basin to the southern plains. Excavations at the plateau of Gergovia reveal storage complexes with capacities surpassing those of contemporary sites, suggesting the ability to amass surplus grain through regional networks of dependent settlements. Soil chemistry from these facilities shows elevated calcium and phosphate levels linked to prolonged storage of cereals and livestock products. Combined with concentrations of iron weaponry, especially long lateen swords and spearheads, this evidence supports the presence of a wealthy and militarily capable polity. Classical sources later describe the Arverni as a dominant power, and although these accounts postdate the archaeological contexts, the material record signals a level of organization consistent with such influence. Environmental factors contributed to shifting dynamics during this period. Pollen sequences from wetlands in Burgundy and the Auvergne indicate fluctuations in agricultural intensity, with alternating phases of cereal expansion and woodland regeneration. These patterns may reflect demographic pressures or temporary disruptions in land use caused by conflict or political realignment. Sediment cores from floodplains show episodes of heightened erosion, possibly linked to overgrazing or increased cultivation on marginal soils. Such environmental instabilities likely intensified the competition for fertile land and grazing territories, further fueling tensions among tribes situated along ecological transition zones. Material traces of conflict appear in multiple regions. Excavations at several oppida reveal fortification enhancements, ditch recuttings, rampart reinforcements, and newly constructed gate complexes, corresponding to radiocarbon dates situated within the mid-2nd century BC. At one site near the Marne, archaeologists uncovered concentrations of arrowheads and sling stones near entranceways, suggesting a localized assault or defensive skirmish. Yet even these martial signatures often coexist with uninterrupted domestic layers immediately above, indicating that conflict was episodic rather than systemic. The societies of Gaul possessed mechanisms for absorbing disruption while maintaining regional economic and political coherence. Amid this complex environment, diplomacy took on heightened significance. Artifact patterns suggest periodic gatherings where tribes negotiated alliances and reaffirmed boundaries. At Corinth, a meeting enclosure used for centuries exhibits a layer dated to this period, containing a dense mixture of amphora sherds, butchered cattle bones, fine lateen ceramics, and fragments of imported bronze vessels. The scale of feasting implied by these deposits points toward events aimed at securing political cohesion during times of heightened tension. Such gatherings served not only as opportunities for negotiation, but as performative assertions of status, where leaders demonstrated their ability to command resources and cultivate broad alliances. Conceptually, the pre-Caesarian period of Gaul was characterized by a dynamic interplay between cooperation and rivalry. Tribal polities operated within a shared cultural framework, manifested in artistic motifs, ritual practices, and settlement organization, yet their political ambitions and economic interests frequently diverged. This tension produced cycles of alliance, competition, and consolidation that shaped the broader landscape. The increasing prominence of powerful tribes, such as the Aedui and Arvani, reflects both regional ecological suitability and strategic control of trade routes, laying the foundations for the political configurations that would define Gaul at the moment Roman expansion began to intersect with its internal affairs. The rising tensions of the mid-2nd century BC unfolded against a backdrop of wider geopolitical movements that increasingly influenced Gaulish affairs. The south, Roman expansion reshaped the balance of power in the Western Mediterranean. The fall of Carthage in 146 BC marked the consolidation of Roman authority across formerly contested regions, allowing the Republic to turn its attention toward the territories north of the Alps. Archaeological evidence from southern Gaul reflects this shift through the establishment of new trading colonies, fortified stations, and administrative outposts designed to stabilize commercial routes. Sites near modern-day Narbonne, stratified layers, contain Roman amphorae, campaniform ceramics, and stamped tiles that date to this period, indicating a growing Roman presence along the Mediterranean littoral. These installations served as both economic nodes and diplomatic footholds, enabling Rome to engage more directly with interior tribes whose networks were increasingly tied to Mediterranean commerce. The arrival of Roman merchants and agents intensified existing intertribal rivalries. The Aedui, positioned advantageously along the Saône, sought Roman support to counter the influence of the Arvani and their allies. While textual references to these diplomatic exchanges come from later sources, their archaeological correlates can be traced through shifting patterns of imported goods. Aeduan sites from this period contain marked increases in Italian amphorae and fineware, while contemporaneous Arvanian contexts display a more substantial reliance on regional products supplemented by selective imports. This divergence suggests differing strategies for managing external relationships. The Aedui cultivated Roman favor through commercial cooperation, while the Arvani maintained broader alliances that extended into the Upper Loire and Massif Central. Warfare between these rising powers left material signatures across multiple regions. At a hill fort near the Allier River, excavations uncovered defensive ditches containing arrowheads, spear points, and broken shields intermingled with collapsed rampart timbers. Radiocarbon dating places these destruction layers within the mid-2nd century BC, aligning with textual references to conflicts between the Aedui and Arvani. The presence of both local and imported weapon types suggests that these confrontations involved warrior contingents drawn from several allied tribes. The rapid rebuilding visible in subsequent layers, marked by newly cut post holes and fortified entrances, demonstrates the resilience of Gaulish communities, which adapted quickly to the shifting political landscape. Economic pressures contributed to these cycles of conflict. The growth of oppida and the expansion of long-distance trade placed demands on agricultural productivity. Environmental studies from the Seine Valley indicate intensified cereal cultivation during this period, reflected in deep plough marks preserved beneath later deposits. Such intensification may have strained smaller farming communities, increasing the likelihood of disputes over land and resources. In certain regions, pollen data reveals short-lived declines in cereal indicators accompanied by rises in ruderal species, suggesting temporary disruptions in cultivation that may correlate with episodes of conflict or political instability. These ecological fluctuations illustrate the fragile balance between agricultural systems and the political structures that depended on them. Ritual practices during this period reflect the interplay between internal conflict and efforts at maintaining cohesion. At Gurney-sur-Aronde, weapon deposits from the 2nd century BC include long lateen swords deliberately bent before placement, shield bosses pierced through their centers, and spearheads intentionally blunted, material acts that transformed instruments of war into objects of ritual offering. The spatial distribution of these items within the sanctuary follows structured patterns aligned with earlier depositional traditions, suggesting that established ceremonial frameworks were employed to interpret or manage periods of instability. Animal remains from the same context show evidence of large-scale feasting, reinforcing the role of ritual gatherings as moments for reaffirming communal bonds during politically uncertain times. Evidence from smaller settlements also reveals adaptive strategies. In the Moselle region, clusters of farmsteads show reinforcement of enclosure ditches and the addition of small watchtowers, timber structures anchored in deep post holes, suggesting increased attention to local defense. Yet these defensive measures coexisted with signs of continued economic productivity. Granaries expanded in size, loom weights and spindle whorls appear in greater numbers, and iron tools show patterns of consistent maintenance and resharpening. This coexistence indicates a society capable of balancing the demands of security with the necessities of daily life and regional production. Conceptually, the period preceding the Gallic Wars can be understood as a moment of both consolidation and fragmentation. The emergence of dominant tribes, the intensification of economic systems, and the introduction of Roman political interests created a complex web of alliances and rivalries. Within this framework, Gaulish polities negotiated identity and authority through material practices, fortification construction, weapon deposition, feasting rituals, and the maintenance of trade networks. These practices not only reflected the pressures of the era, but also shaped the political landscape that Rome would encounter as its expansion moved northward. As the century advanced, these dynamics sharpened. Alliances hardened, rivalries deepened, and the corridors of trade and diplomacy became increasingly contested. Into this environment of competition and uncertainty entered new actors and escalating conflicts that would culminate in large-scale confrontations, setting the stage for the next phase of Gaul's history, the wars that preceded Caesar's campaigns. As the 2nd century BC progressed into its final decades, the political dynamics of Gaul displayed a pattern of intensifying regional polarization. The rivalry between the Aedui and the Arverni, already visible in settlement archaeology and numismatic circulation, reached a scale that influenced the entire central plateau. Excavations at multiple oppida, Bibracte, Gergovia, and Corinth among them, contain destruction layers dated to this period through radiocarbon sequences and cross-reference ceramic typologies. These layers preserve evidence of abrupt conflict, charred wall fragments, collapsed timber frameworks, and concentrations of sling stones clustered near gateways. Yet above these destruction levels lie carefully reconstructed habitation floors, indicating that conflicts were localized events occurring within a broader landscape that remained socially and economically robust. The recurrence of such layers suggests a political environment marked by repeated episodes of confrontation followed by rapid recovery. The presence of large-scale hordes from this period offers additional insight into the political atmosphere. Across the Seine, Marne, and Loire regions, caches of torques, coins, and weapon fragments appear buried in pits or concealed beneath collapsed structures. Metallurgical analyses reveal that many torques were crafted from high-purity gold alloys, their twisted forms produced through skilled annealing and controlled hammering. The decision to bury such wealth, often in clusters far from habitation zones, has been interpreted as a response to political uncertainty, whether precautionary concealment during conflict or ritual deposition meant to invoke divine protection. Stratigraphic associations demonstrate that many hoards were never recovered, suggesting that their owners were unable or unwilling to reclaim them, perhaps due to shifting territorial control or political displacement. Meanwhile, demographic patterns across Gaul show signs of strain. In the Paris basin, surveys of rural settlements reveal abandoned farmsteads replaced by smaller, more defensible enclosures positioned on elevated ground. Soil micromorphology within these reduced settlements indicates shorter occupation spans and less intensive agricultural activity, as reflected in thinner midden layers and reduced botanical diversity. Such shifts may be linked to insecurity along key trade routes, where the movement of goods and people became more vulnerable to disruption as alliances fractured and competing tribal coalitions vied for control. Yet even in these more constrained rural contexts, evidence of continued textile production, ironworking, and livestock management demonstrates that local economies adapted without collapsing. The political landscape of this era cannot be understood solely through conflict. Equally important were the mechanisms for negotiation and alliance building that persisted despite intertribal rivalries. At meeting enclosures like Corinth, stratigraphic layers corresponding to the late 2nd century BC contain substantial quantities of amphora fragments, butchered animal remains, and imported bronze ornaments, materials that signal continued large-scale gatherings. These layers, characterized by dense debris from feasting and ceremonial activity, demonstrate that communal negotiation remained central to political life. Radiocarbon data places these events within intervals that coincide with known periods of intertribal diplomacy, suggesting that leaders leveraged ritual performance to stabilize alliances, reassert territorial agreements, and cultivate loyalties among their followers. In this volatile environment, certain tribes began to assert influence beyond their traditional domains. Archaeological evidence from the Lower Rhine and Moselle suggests the emergence of Belgic groups whose settlements exhibit intensified craft production and growing militarization. Oppida in this region, such as Titelberg, contain weapon assemblages with distinctive forms, including elongated spearheads and shield fittings characterized by angular motifs. These sites also show increased use of coinage bearing abstract symbols, perhaps representing tribal affiliations or issuing authorities. The circulation of these coins into Central Gaul indicates expanding Belgic influence and the formation of new networks that challenged older hegemonies. Environmental data from this period adds further complexity. Sediment cores from river valleys record episodes of increased flooding, possibly linked to climatic fluctuations that affected agricultural output. In certain regions, cereal pollen decreases briefly, replaced by indicators of fallow land or abandoned fields. Such ecological disruptions may have heightened the urgency of political competition, as tribes sought to secure fertile territories and reliable trade routes in response to environmental uncertainty. Nonetheless, these disruptions do not signal collapse. Rather, they reflect the adaptive capacity of Gaulish communities as they navigated pressures from both natural and political forces. Conceptually, the final decades before the Gallic Wars represent a threshold in Gaulish history, a moment when internal competition, external influence, and ecological fluctuation intersected to reshape political identities. The material record portrays a society neither static nor fragile, but one negotiating shifting power balances through a combination of martial readiness, ritual performance, economic adaptation, and strategic alliance-making. These mechanisms of authority, deeply rooted in Latin traditions, formed the structural foundations upon which Gaul would confront the expanding power of Rome. As these dynamics intensified, a new phase of conflict unfolded across southern and central Gaul, a phase involving migrations, regional coalitions, and growing entanglement with Roman ambitions. These developments created the immediate conditions that would precede Caesar's entry into Gaul, setting the stage for the campaigns that would soon reshape the continent. By the mid-1st century BC, the political and social landscape of Gaul had reached a state of volatility that would provide the immediate backdrop for the campaigns of Julius Caesar. The preceding decades had produced shifting alliances, intensified competition among dominant tribes, and mounting pressures along the Mediterranean frontier, where Roman expansion increasingly intersected with Gallic affairs. Archaeological evidence from southern Gaul captures the early phases of this entanglement. At Glanum and nearby sites in the lower Rhone Valley, layers dated to the early 1st century BC show Roman defensive structures constructed alongside pre-existing Gaulish settlements. These fortifications, rectangular in layout, built with stone socles and standardized timber frameworks, indicate a Roman military presence designed to secure the approaches between the Mediterranean coast and the interior river systems. Ceramic assemblages from these layers include Italian amphorae, black gloss pottery, and stamped tiles produced by Roman legions, demonstrating a sustained occupation rather than temporary intervention. The increasing instability within Gaul is likewise visible in the material record of tribal centers. At Bibracte, late Latin layers contain signs of architectural modification keyed to defensive concerns, widened ramparts, strengthened gateways, and additional earthworks positioned to control access to the plateau. Similar patterns appear at Gergovia and Avaricum, where ditch recuttings and rapid construction of palisades suggest responses to political pressures that predate Caesar's arrival. Radiocarbon sequences indicate these efforts began in the 70s and 60s BC, coinciding with periods of conflict described in later textual sources. The presence of both imported and locally produced weaponry in these layers, long iron swords, spearheads, and belts with bronze fittings, reflects a mobilization of resources consistent with preparation for large-scale conflict. One of the clearest archaeological signatures of pre-Caesarian unrest emerges from the Helvetian homeland in the Swiss plateau. Settlement surveys indicate widespread abandonment of farmsteads during the mid-1st century BC, with material culture showing abrupt termination, pottery left in hearths, storage pits containing unharvested grains, and domestic structures vacated without gradual decline. Pollen data from lakes in the region reveals a marked reduction in cereal indicators during the same period, corroborating the cessation of agricultural activity. These patterns support the interpretation, corresponding to textual accounts, that the Helvetii sought to migrate westward in search of new territories. The material traces of this movement appear not only in abandoned sites, but in scattered weapon deposits along the western Alpine foothills, where spearheads and shield fragments have been found in shallow pits aligned with possible migration routes. Further evidence of destabilization appears in hoards concealed during this period. Across eastern Gaul, caches of coins, many associated with the Sequani and Helvetii, were buried in remote locations, often beneath thin layers of soil in marshy ground or at the bases of trees. Metallurgical analyses reveal consistent alloy composition within each hoard, implying they represent the wealth of single households or political factions. Their concealment, and the fact that few were retrieved, suggests that local elites anticipated upheaval. These hoards, combined with fortified hilltops undergoing hurried reconstruction, demonstrate a climate of uncertainty in which established power structures were strained by demographic pressures, regional conflict, and geopolitical shifts to the south. Diplomatic interactions between Rome and certain Gallic tribes intensified during these years. Although the written record offering direct testimony comes from Roman authors, archaeological correlates support the notion of strengthened ties. At Aegean sites, amphora concentrations increase sharply in late Latine layers, indicating preferential trade relationships with Roman merchants. Coin hoards from Aegean territories contain higher proportions of Roman silver, and imported fineware appears in elite compounds alongside traditional Gaulish ceramics. These patterns imply political alignment reinforced by material exchange, setting the Aedui in opposition to the Arvani and Sequani, who maintained alliances aimed at resisting Roman influence. In this fracturing landscape, ritual sites continued to function as focal points of identity, yet their material signatures shift subtly during this period. At sanctuaries such as Gurney-sur-Aronde, late deposits contain fewer complete weapons and more fragmentary offerings, possibly reflecting resource pressures or strategic redirection of martial equipment toward impending conflicts. Animal remains from these layers indicate smaller-scale feasting events compared to earlier centuries, with reduced quantities of cattle and an increased reliance on sheep and pigs. Such shifts hint at changing economic conditions as political tensions grew and communities directed their efforts toward defense and alliance consolidation. Conceptually, the decades preceding Caesar's arrival represent a convergence of internal instability and external pressure unprecedented in earlier Gaulish history. The material record portrays a society still rich in cultural cohesion, but increasingly strained by demographic movements, territorial contestation, and the strategic intervention of a Mediterranean power whose interests were beginning to shape the political future of the region. The structures of governance, ritual, and alliance that had sustained Gaul for centuries were entering a phase of intensified transformation, one that would soon intersect with Roman military doctrine on a scale not yet witnessed in the continental interior. The entry of Julius Caesar into Gaul in 58 BC occurred at a moment when the region's internal dynamics had already reached a critical threshold, and the archaeological record preserves several of the structural conditions that shaped his early campaigns. The Helvetian migration, often treated in textual accounts as a singular dramatic event, appears in material terms as the culmination of years of mounting demographic pressure. Large-scale abandonment across the Swiss plateau, documented through settlement layers containing uncollected grain, intact ceramic hearth assemblages, and unfinished craftwork, suggests a coordinated departure rather than a sudden flight. Botanical residues from storage pits show cereals left in situ through a growing season, reinforcing the picture of a population relocating en masse. The movement of thousands of people across the Jura passages would have strained neighboring territories, and spear deposits found in shallow pits along the Aar and Saône rivers may represent defensive skirmishes between migrating groups and communities resisting their passage. Caesar's intervention altered this trajectory. Battlefield archaeology from the region near modern Lake Geneva, though fragmentary, includes concentrations of late Latine weaponry, spearheads, javelin points, and fragments of oval shields, scattered across layers of alluvial sediment. These distributions align with descriptions of engagement between Roman forces and Helvetian contingents attempting to bypass Roman fortifications along the Rhone. Soil compaction patterns and trampled strata indicate repeated movement through constrained riverbanks, supporting the notion of attempted crossings met with organized resistance. Although the textual narrative provides detailed accounts, the archaeological traces, metallic scatter, disrupted soil horizons, and isolated human bone fragments offer an independent framework for interpreting the confrontation. The subsequent reorientation of Helvetian groups back toward the plateau finds its material expression in the reoccupation of several abandoned settlements. At multiple sites, shallow habitation layers overlay earlier abandonment phases, marked by newly dug post holes and reorganized interior layouts. These reconstructions, dated through radiocarbon analysis to the late 50s BC, contain fewer imported goods and more standardized local ceramics, suggesting communities operating under new constraints while re-establishing domestic economies. The absence of large storage pits in some reoccupied sites may reflect a temporary reduction in agricultural capacity or a strategic shift towards smaller, more defensible household units in the aftermath of forced relocation. As Caesar moved to address what he framed as threats to Roman interests, further archaeological indicators tracked the spread of conflict. The Belgic uprising of 57 BC, described in Roman texts as a vast coalition, appears across multiple sites in northern Gaul through layers, showing sudden intensification of defensive construction. At Titelberg, ditch recuttings and enlarged rampart extensions correspond to this period, while newly excavated pits contain iron gouges and woodworking debris consistent with rapid timber harvesting for fortification. In nearby rural settlements, animal bone assemblages show increased proportions of sheep and goats, a possible sign of pastoral mobility as communities adapted to wartime conditions. These patterns hint at the logistical reorganization undertaken by Belgic groups preparing for large-scale resistance. Caesar's response, conducted through rapid marches and targeted campaigns, left additional material traces. Along the Samba River, finds of Roman pila, hobnails from legionary footwear, and fragments of Montefortino helmets align with battlefield positions described in textual accounts. The distribution of these artifacts, scattered across low terraces and partially embedded within silt layers, suggests a multi-phased engagement rather than a single concentrated clash. The presence of Gallic weaponry in nearby layers indicates counteroffensive maneuvers by Belgic warriors whose equipment displays regional variation, including elongated spearheads and shield bosses with angular lateen designs. These mixed deposits offer a rare archaeological window onto the chaotic conditions of mid-1st century warfare. Following these events, Caesar's consolidation efforts appear in the archaeological record not as widespread destruction, but as selective impositions upon the infrastructural and administrative systems of specific tribes. At Avaricum, destruction layers dated to this period include burned architectural beams, carbonized grain, and collapsed wall segments, consistent with documented sieges. Yet nearby rural sites exhibit continuity, with botanical samples and ceramic assemblages showing uninterrupted occupation. This uneven pattern reflects Caesar's strategic targeting of key oppida rather than a comprehensive campaign against civilian populations. The resilience of rural communities, visible in continued agricultural production and stable craft activity, underscores the adaptive capacity of Gaulish society even as military engagements reshaped regional hierarchies. Conceptually, Caesar's early campaigns can be understood through the interplay of internal and external forces visible in the archaeological record. The migration of the Helvetii, the Belgic coalition, and the shifting alliances among Central Gallic tribes were not products of Roman intervention alone, but of long-standing pressures within the cultural and political landscapes of Gaul. Caesar's arrival intersected with these dynamics at a moment of instability, amplifying their consequences while redirecting their trajectories. The archaeological signatures, abandoned settlements, hastily reinforced oppida, weapon scatters across floodplains, and ritual deposits containing fragmentary offerings, capture a region negotiating the pressures of conflict even as its social structures remained deeply rooted in lateen traditions. As these campaigns unfolded, the conflicts deepened. The next phase would bring Caesar into direct confrontation with some of the most formidable tribal coalitions of the period, producing sieges whose archaeological remains preserve the imprint of strategic innovation, sustained resistance, and the reshaping of Gaulish political identity. By the winter of 57–56 BC, the intensifying cycle of conflict in Gaul had begun to reveal a deeper pattern: the gradual reconfiguration of regional power structures under the pressure of sustained Roman intervention. The archaeological signatures of this transition are visible across a wide geographic range, where settlement destruction, hasty reconstruction, strategic abandonment, and concentrated depositions each reflect evolving tribal responses to changing political realities. At sites in the Armorican Peninsula, such as the oppidum at Paul, defensive ditches were deepened and ramparts reinforced during this period, aligning with textual references to coordinated resistance among the Veneti and their allies. Excavations of harbor installations along the coast show sudden shifts in material assemblages, reduced quantities of imported pottery, increased reliance on coarse local wares, and a temporary decline in amphora residues, suggesting a disruption in maritime exchange caused by Rome's naval blockade. The Veneti conflict itself leaves indirect traces in the form of shipbuilding debris discovered in bays and estuaries along Brittany's southern coast. Fragments of thick timber planking, fastened with heavy iron nails and dowels, match classical descriptions of robust Armorican vessels designed for Atlantic conditions. Radiocarbon analysis places several of these fragments within the mid-1st century BC, and their distribution along tidal flats corresponds to areas where Roman naval forces are believed to have engaged coastal fleets. These remains, though fragmentary, hint at the maritime capacities of Gaulish polities and the stakes involved in controlling seaborne trade during a period of military escalation. Inland, the resistance of Belgic and Central Gallic groups manifests in intensified fortification efforts. At the oppidum of Alesia, later the site of one of the most consequential sieges in Gallic history, earlier construction phases reveal a settlement already outfitted with substantial defensive works prior to Caesar's encirclement. Deep ditches, terraced ramparts, and narrow gate passages characterize the pre-siege layers, indicating long-standing strategic concerns independent of Roman threat. Soil micromorphology within these layers shows compacted surfaces linked to foot traffic patterns consistent with defensive patrol routes, suggesting that the community had developed security measures well before its dramatic confrontation with Roman forces. Weapon deposits from this period display increased fragmentation, a pattern that may reflect both intensified conflict and evolving ritual interpretations. At sanctuaries such as Riedmont-sur-Ancre, late Latine layers contain spearheads snapped deliberately at the socket and sword fragments bent at sharp angles before deposition. These acts of ritual neutralization, long established in Gaulish tradition, may have taken on heightened significance as communities confronted the uncertainties of war. The animal remains deposited alongside these weapons, primarily cattle, processed in large feasting events, suggest that ritual gatherings persisted even during moments of crisis, reinforcing communal identity amid external pressure. Evidence of Roman logistical presence appears in multiple regions during this phase of conflict. Along routes crossing the Seine and Marne, traces of temporary marching camps have been identified through rectilinear ditch systems and internal hearth features, whose ceramic and botanical assemblages reflect short-term occupation by organized groups. These camps follow a standardized layout characteristic of Roman military engineering, with gateways aligned along cardinal axes and drainage systems designed to manage runoff. The presence of such camps, dated by associated artifacts including hobnails, pillar points, and fragments of Roman corsuea, provides a spatial framework for mapping troop movements described in textual narratives. Yet despite Roman advances, many Gaulish polities demonstrated remarkable resilience. At Bibracte, habitation layers contemporary with Caesar's campaigns show uninterrupted domestic activity, hearths containing cooking residues, weaving debris distributed across household floors, and storage features indicating continued agricultural surplus. Even in regions where conflict was acute, rural settlements demonstrate stability through botanical and faunal analyses that reveal sustained cereal cultivation and livestock management. These findings underscore the capacity of Gaulish communities to maintain core economic functions while undergoing significant military and political upheaval. Conceptually, the final years of open conflict before the Great Pan-Gallic Uprising can be understood as a period in which overlapping systems of identity, allegiance, and territoriality were stressed, but not yet broken. The archaeological record reveals a mosaic of responses: local fortification, ritual reaffirmation, economic adaptation, and strategic diplomacy, that together formed the structural resilience of Gaulish societies. These communities were neither disorganized nor uniformly overwhelmed. Rather, they negotiated the pressures of external power while preserving traditions deeply rooted in Latin's social logic. As these pressures mounted, however, certain leaders emerged who were capable of articulating collective resistance on a scale that exceeded regional boundaries. Their ability to mobilize warriors, coordinate supplies, and speak across tribal divisions created the conditions for the most significant coalition of the Gallic Wars, setting the stage for confrontations whose material traces, fortification rings, siege works, and burned layers, remain among the most striking in Iron Age archaeology. The aftermath of the Roman conquest brought a profound reorganization of Gaul's political, economic, and cultural landscape, yet the archaeological record reveals a transition far more intricate than simple replacement. The first decades after Caesar's campaigns show patterns of selective continuity woven alongside abrupt transformations, producing a post-conquest world in which indigenous traditions persisted within newly imposed administrative frameworks. Across former tribal centers, such as Bibracte, Avaricum, and Gergovia, stratigraphic sequences record layers of reconstruction that incorporate Roman building techniques without entirely displacing local forms. At Bibracte, for instance, post-siege habitation layers include timber-framed structures featuring tiled roofs, an innovation linked to Roman architectural influence, while their internal layouts preserve the compartmentalized spatial patterns characteristic of earlier Latin domestic arrangements. Ceramic assemblages from these contexts contain a mixture of local hand-built wares and imported Roman finewares, suggesting that households selectively adopted foreign materials according to function or status. New administrative centers began to emerge during this period, marking the early phases of Roman provincial organization. Lugdunum, founded in 43 BC at the confluence of the Rhone and Saône, displays urban features that signal deliberate planning: a rectilinear street grid, standardized building plots, and public structures constructed with stone foundations. Excavations beneath later Roman layers reveal early phases containing both imported Italian building materials and locally produced ceramics, indicating a transitional community composed of Roman officials, merchants, and Gaulish inhabitants. Soil chemistry within market zones shows elevated concentrations of metal residues and organic waste, evidence of expanded commercial activity facilitated by centralized administration. These new urban centers functioned as hubs for taxation, military logistics, and political assembly, linking the interior of Gaul more directly to the institutional frameworks of the Roman world. Yet outside these emerging cities, continuity remains evident in rural settlement patterns. Surveys of the Seine and Loire valleys show persistent use of small farmsteads, many of which retain their earlier architectural forms. Post-conquest botanical samples from these sites indicate stable cereal cultivation, barley, spelt, and emmer, alongside increases in fruit-bearing species such as plum and apple, likely reflecting the introduction of new horticultural practices under Roman influence. Faunal remains reveal a gradual shift toward greater exploitation of cattle relative to sheep and pigs, a change that aligns with Roman demand for leather and draft animals. These modifications suggest adaptation rather than replacement, as rural communities integrated new economic opportunities into established agricultural routines. Material traces of Roman military presence during the consolidation period appear across strategic corridors. Temporary camps identified through rectilinear ditch systems and patterned post-hole clusters dot the landscapes near river crossings and upland passes. Associated artifact assemblages, hobnails, fragments of Roman corsuea, and standardized tent peg fittings indicate brief, repeated occupations consistent with patrols or road construction crews. Along the Rhone Valley, segments of early roadworks have been uncovered, featuring compacted gravel layers and drainage ditches aligned with Roman surveying practices. These infrastructural developments facilitated communication between administrative centers, enabling the province to function as an integrated territorial unit rather than a collection of loosely connected tribal regions. The religious landscape also underwent transformation. though not through the eradication of earlier traditions. Instead, the archaeological record shows the emergence of hybrid sanctuaries where Roman architectural features coexist with indigenous ritual practices. At sources such as Chamalières and Saints Maries de la Mer, wooden ex-votos depicting human limbs, heads, or domestic objects appear alongside imported dedicatory altars bearing Latin inscriptions. These offerings, often carved in styles continuous with late Latin artistic traditions, attest to the persistence of local beliefs within newly formalized religious settings. Metallurgical analyses of coin offerings from such sanctuaries demonstrate mixed circulation. Roman denarii placed beside Gaulish bronze issues, reflecting worshippers who operated simultaneously within Roman economic systems and inherited cultural frameworks. Conceptually, the early post-conquest era represents a period of recalibration rather than rupture. Roman administration introduced new modes of authority, taxation, infrastructure, public assembly, yet the social fabric of Gaul remained anchored in practices that had developed over centuries. Local elites adapted by integrating Roman symbols into their existing status systems, adopting new materials and forms without abandoning traditional mechanisms of influence. The archaeological record reveals a landscape negotiating two worlds, one shaped by long-standing Latin structures and another emerging from Roman political logic. As these processes unfolded, the balance between continuity and change became increasingly complex. The next phase of this transformation would see the expansion of Roman civic life, intensified integration into Mediterranean markets, and a gradual redefinition of regional identities, producing a provincial society in which Gaulish traditions persisted within the framework of empire. During the 1st century BC and the ensuing decades, Roman consolidation in Gaul produced transformations visible not only in urban planning and administrative structures, but also in the rhythms of everyday life. Across the newly established province, patterns of consumption, production, and mobility shifted as Roman economic systems extended into the interior. Excavations at Lugdunum and Augustodunum reveal flourishing commercial districts marked by dense accumulations of amphorae fragments, fineware sherds, and imported metal vessels. Soil chemistry mapping within these zones indicates the presence of workshops devoted to metal casting, pottery production, and textile dyeing. The concentration of industrial activities alongside residential quarters demonstrates that Roman cities in Gaul, like those elsewhere in the empire, functioned as integrated hubs where economic, social, and civic life unfolded in close proximity. Transport networks expanded to support these urban centers. Sections of early Roman roads uncovered near Sens and Autun display the characteristic engineering of imperial infrastructure. Compacted gravel bases overlaid with dressed stone, flanked by drainage ditches and periodically marked by milestone fragments. Such roads facilitated rapid movement of goods and officials, linking isolated rural areas to emerging market towns. Excavations along these routes reveal small mansions, waystations constructed with standardized layouts, including hearths, stables, and storage rooms, designed to serve travelers and imperial agents. The ceramic assemblages recovered from these structures contain a mixture of locally produced wares and imported sigillata, underscoring their role in connecting different scales of economic circulation. Rural settlement patterns, though transformed, retained significant continuity with earlier Latin structures. Field surveys across the Paris Basin, Burgundy, and the Massif Central identify numerous farmsteads that persisted into the Roman period, their architectural footprints modified rather than abandoned. Many show evidence of Roman influence in the adoption of stone foundations or tiled roofs, yet their internal arrangements, courtyards, granaries, and livestock enclosures remain consistent with Iron Age traditions. Botanical remains from these sites document subtle adjustments in agricultural regimes. Wheat varieties, particularly bread wheat, grow more prevalent, while the presence of grape pips increases modestly, signaling the introduction of viticulture in select regions. These shifts align with broader Roman agricultural practices while illustrating local agency in adopting new crops. Faunal analyses reveal further adaptation. Cattle become increasingly dominant in livestock assemblages, reflecting Roman preferences for meat, leather, and draft power. At the same time, pig remains remain abundant, indicating continuity in indigenous husbandry traditions. Bone tool assemblages from both urban and rural sites show increased specialization, with awls, needles, and scrapers crafted from standardized blanks. These tools, used in leatherworking and textile production, point toward expanded craft industries capable of supplying growing urban populations. Such patterns illustrate the merging of Roman economic demands with local production capabilities. Religion, too, underwent a process of integration. Excavations at sanctuaries across Gaul, new at St. George's, Le Chatelet, and the region near Lutetia, show the coexistence of Roman temple forms with indigenous votive traditions. At many sites, temples constructed with ashlar masonry house altars bearing Latin inscriptions dedicated to both Roman deities and syncretized local gods. Surrounding these structures, pits contain wooden ex-votos carved in traditional Gaulish styles, limbs rendered in stylized proportions, human faces with almond-shaped eyes, and miniature replicas of tools or weapons. Metallurgical analysis of coin offerings shows a mix of Roman and Gaulish currency, suggesting that worshippers navigated multiple symbolic systems simultaneously. These hybrid sanctuaries reflect a religious landscape shaped by negotiation rather than replacement, where older practices adapted seamlessly within new architectural and administrative contexts. Evidence of cultural adaptation also appears in domestic ritual. Household shrines, discovered as clusters of small ceramic vessels, figurines, or bronze offerings placed in niches or near hearths, reveal the persistence of protective traditions rooted in Iron Age domestic worship. These assemblages, often found intact, suggest continuity in how families marked life cycle events, sought protection, or honored ancestral spirits, even as public religion became increasingly Romanized. Numismatic patterns provide additional insights into the mechanisms of integration. During the early imperial period, Roman mints supplied large quantities of bronze and silver coinage to Gaul, yet local mints continued to operate in some regions. Coins recovered from rural settlements include both Roman issues and late Gaulish types, sometimes appearing together in small hoards. Metallurgical profiles demonstrate that Gaulish bronze coins persisted in circulation for decades after the conquest, indicating an extended period of economic duality. This coexistence reflects the gradual nature of provincial incorporation, where monetary practices adjusted incrementally rather than uniformly. Conceptually, the early Roman decades in Gaul reveal a society navigating the interface between imperial systems and local traditions. Urban centers flourished as nodes of commerce and administration. Roads and way stations linked regions with unprecedented speed, and craft industries expanded to meet new demands. Yet the foundations of rural life, domestic ritual, and local identity remained firmly rooted in practices shaped by centuries of Latin culture. The archaeological record captures this equilibrium, a landscape transformed by empire yet still anchored in the material grammars of its past. As the 1st century AD approached, these patterns began to coalesce into a stable provincial society marked by expanding civic institutions, deepening integration into Mediterranean markets, and the enduring presence of Gaulish cultural forms. The next phase would see the full development of Romanized urban life, monumental architecture, and the complex interplay between provincial identity and imperial governance. As the 1st century BC gave way to the 1st century AD, the consolidation of Roman rule across Gaul reached a stage where provincial structures began to assume stable and enduring forms. Urban centers expanded in size, complexity, and architectural ambition, embodying the administrative, economic, and cultural mechanisms through which Rome integrated conquered territories into the wider imperial system. At Lugdunum, the provincial capital, archaeological layers from the early imperial period reveal the construction of monumental public buildings, amphitheaters, basilicas, and bath complexes built with limestone blocks transporting from nearby quarries. Soil analyses from construction zones show traces of lime kilns, brick furnaces, and stone-cutting debris, providing a material record of the logistical networks necessary to sustain urbanization. These structures replaced earlier timber buildings and introduced new spatial logics based on Roman civic ideals: open forums, colonnaded squares, and standardized street grids, signaling the transformation of Gaulish political life into a provincial framework. Yet even as cities grew, evidence from domestic quarters indicates that cultural adaptation proceeded gradually and unevenly. Excavations in residential districts at Autun and Reims reveal houses combining Roman architectural features: tiled roofs, plastered walls, hypocaust heating systems, with interior arrangements that retain elements of earlier Latin domestic organization. Hearths remain central to household layouts, and storage pits persist beneath some floors, indicating continuity in food preparation and preservation practices. Pottery assemblages from these spaces include both imported sigillata and coarse wares shaped in traditional forms. Botanical residues inside storage vessels suggest mixed consumption patterns. Mediterranean olives and figs appear alongside barley, millet, and preserved pork products, demonstrating that dietary habits incorporated new elements without displacing indigenous culinary traditions. Rural landscapes continued to reflect a mosaic of continuity and adaptation. In many regions, villa complexes began to emerge, characterized by stone-built farm residences, granaries on raised platforms, and adjacent workspaces for craft production. Excavations at villas near the Loire and Moselle show evidence of large-scale grain storage and wine production, including stone-lined vats and presses. These facilities demonstrate shifts in agricultural practice aimed at producing surpluses for urban and military markets. Yet smaller farmsteads persisted alongside villas, maintaining traditional architectural forms with post-built structures and earth-floored storage areas. Botanical and faunal remains from these sites reveal ongoing reliance on mixed agriculture, grain cultivation complemented by pig, sheep, and cattle husbandry, suggesting that rural communities adapted to new economic demands without abandoning long-standing local strategies. Religion underwent comparable forms of transformation. Sanctuaries across Gaul increasingly adopted Roman architectural typologies: rectangular chelys, porticos, and stone altars, but continued to house votive practices rooted in pre-Roman belief systems. At tribal centers such as Gournay-sur-Aronde and Maillebois-sur-Bèze, excavations reveal that earlier enclosures were replaced or augmented by masonry temples, yet deposition practices persisted. Pits containing weapon fragments, animal bones, and wooden figurines appear alongside inscribed altars dedicated to syncretized deities, such as Mars Lenus or Mercury Lugus. Metallurgical analyses of votive offerings show that bronze and iron objects were still intentionally damaged prior to deposition, echoing rituals that had defined the religious landscape of Latin Gaul. These hybrid practices underscore how provincial religion emerged not through replacement, but through layered continuity, where Roman and Gaulish forms coexisted and fused. Administrative integration left further impressions in material culture. Inscriptions on stone stelae from the early imperial period record the names of local elites who entered Roman civic life as magistrates, priests, or municipal patrons. These individuals often adopted Roman nomenclature while retaining references to their tribal origins, signaling a dual identity negotiated within the frameworks of empire. Coin hoards and scattered finds from this period include increased proportions of Roman imperial issues, yet local minting continued for decades in certain regions, producing bronze coins bearing indigenous motifs alongside Latin inscriptions. This coexistence reflects a transitional economic environment where Roman monetary systems were integrated into pre-existing cultural grammars. Conceptually, the formation of provincial Gaul represents a profound, yet measured recalibration of identity. Roman governance introduced new scales of authority, civic, administrative, and infrastructural, that reshaped public life, while the social practices rooted in Latin traditions remained active in domestic, ritual, and rural contexts. The archaeological record documents not a rupture, but a gradual weaving of imperial forms into the fabric of Gaulish society, producing a hybrid provincial culture that drew on both Roman institutions and indigenous memory. As these patterns stabilized, the spiritual and symbolic frameworks of Gaul entered a new phase of development. The interplay between older religious traditions and imperial cult practices created landscapes where sacred enclosures, monumental temples, and village shrines coexisted along routes linking settlements of varied scale. The next chapter will explore this religious dimension in detail, tracing how ritual, belief, and sanctuary complexes evolved within the shifting political and cultural structures of provincial Gaul. Across the first centuries BC and AD, the religious landscape of Gaul evolved into a complex system where older Celtic traditions and newly introduced Roman practices intersected in layered, site-specific ways. The archaeological evidence preserved in sanctuaries, rural shrines, and urban temples reveals not a simple process of replacement, but a gradual recalibration in which ritual forms, symbolic objects, and sacred spaces retain their indigenous foundations while absorbing new architectural and ideological elements. One of the clearest examples emerges from sanctuary complexes such as Gurney-sur-Aronde, where the transition from open-air enclosures to masonry-built temples unfolded over several generations. Stratigraphic analysis of the site shows that the original timber palisades, once surrounding a ritual pit filled with intentionally damaged weapons, were eventually replaced by stone walls and porticos constructed with locally quarried limestone. Yet beneath these Roman-style structures, deposits of broken spearheads, sword fragments, and cattle bones continued to accumulate in patterned layers, suggesting that core ritual behaviors persisted unchanged. At Riedmont-sur-Ancre, the evolution of sacred architecture mirrors this pattern. The earlier phases, defined by elongated enclosures and mass deposits of human and animal remains, were succeeded by stone-built temples oriented along cardinal axes. Despite the architectural transformation, the votive practices remained rooted in pre-Roman traditions. Excavations have recovered caches of iron weapons deliberately bent or shattered, alongside wooden idols carved in stylized forms characteristic of late Latin iconography. Radiocarbon dates place these depositions well into the Roman period, indicating that Gaulish ritual specialists continued to enact ceremonies centered on the symbolic neutralization of martial implements. The practice, deeply woven into Celtic religious thought, appears to have endured as a framework for negotiating power, identity, and communal memory. Urban religious life followed a similar trajectory. In centers such as Lugdunum, Reims, and Autun, monumental temples dedicated to Roman deities were constructed with ashlar masonry, Corinthian capitals, and paved courtyards. Yet within these grand structures, evidence of indigenous worship appears in the form of inscribed dedications to syncretized gods, such as Mercury combined with Lugus or Mars merged with local warrior deities. Altars bear both Latin inscriptions and iconographic motifs rooted in Gaulish traditions, spirals, rosettes, and stylized animal forms that draw on the curvilinear language of Latin art. The coexistence of these forms suggests that Roman religious frameworks were incorporated into local cosmologies rather than imposed as strict replacements. Rural shrines offer further insight into the everyday expressions of belief. Small sanctuary sites dotting the countryside, often consisting of simple rectangular buildings with surrounding ditches, yield assemblages of clay figurines, miniature weapons, and small bronze objects. Many of these offerings, shaped with simplified anatomical features or geometric abstraction, reflect long-standing domestic rituals centered on protection, fertility, and ancestral veneration. Soil micromorphology within these shrines indicates repeated burning episodes, consistent with the use of hearths or fire pits for offerings. Botanical remains from these contexts, charred grains, fruit seeds, and aromatic herbs, suggest that food offerings played a significant role in rural religious practice. The persistence of such rituals, documented across multiple regions, reflects continuity in the intimate dimensions of belief, even as Roman political structures reshaped public religious spaces. Water cults, deeply rooted in Celtic spirituality, also persisted well into the Roman period. At thermal springs such as Chamalières and Saint Sabine, excavations reveal wooden ex-votos carved into human limbs, body parts, or stylized figures, deposited in association with healing rituals. These offerings, preserved in waterlogged sediments, provide rare insight into the intersection of spiritual and medical practices. Many display tool marks consistent with local woodworking techniques, while their arrangement in layered deposits suggests intentional placement rather than casual disposal. The presence of Roman coins and inscribed altars in later layers demonstrates that these sacred waters were integrated into the imperial religious system, yet the underlying ritual logic, appeals for healing, protection, and community well-being, remain distinctly indigenous. Conceptually, the persistence of these diverse ritual traditions underscores the adaptability of Gaulish religious systems. Rather than being displaced by imperial ideology, local beliefs absorbed new symbols, architectural forms, and liturgical practices in ways that enhanced rather than erased their cultural coherence. The archaeological record documents a spiritual world that balanced continuity and change. Monumental temples rising above landscapes still shaped by ancestral rites, Roman inscriptions occupying spaces where weapon deposits and votive figurines continued to articulate community identity. This layered religious system formed a central element of provincial life, bridging past and present while grounding Gaulish society within the broader patterns of the Roman world. The interaction between Roman and Gaulish religious traditions becomes especially visible in the development of sanctuary landscapes that served not merely as isolated cult sites, but as regional focal points of social and political identity. At sites such as Maebo-Surbes and the sanctuary complex at Achairomance, architectural sequences reveal a gradual layering of structures whose form and function reflect successive generations of ritual innovation. Early timber enclosures, built with palisades arranged around central pits or altars, were replaced during the Roman period by masonry temples built on raised podiums. Yet excavations beneath these later floors consistently reveal earlier ritual deposits, weapon fragments, animal bones, and ceramic vessels arranged in concentric patterns that continued to shape ceremonial practice. The persistence of these foundational deposits suggests that Roman architectural formalization did not erase the memory embedded in the landscape. Instead, it provided a new architectural vocabulary through which long-standing sacred geographies could be rearticulated. At Achairomance, soil micromorphology from ritual precincts shows a repeated sequence of burning events associated with structured deposition. Charcoal concentrations, mixed with crushed ceramics and calcined bone, form distinct lenses that mark phases of communal gatherings. Radiocarbon dating places several of these layers well into the early imperial period, demonstrating the endurance of ceremonial cycles that predated Roman control. In adjacent pits, wooden figurines carved with simplified facial features appear beside Roman coins, indicating the coexistence of indigenous votive traditions with new economic symbols. The presence of miniature tools and stylized weapons reinforces the idea that Gaulish ritual practice centered on symbolic acts of offering, where crafted objects served as material expressions of communal obligation or personal petition. Urban cult centers offer complementary insights into these processes of integration. At Reims, a sanctuary complex constructed during the early Roman period includes a series of altars inscribed to deities whose names blend local and Roman identities: Mars Camulus, Mercury Visucius, Jupiter Poninus. These hybrid dedications reveal a conceptual merging in which foreign divine forms were anchored within existing cosmological frameworks. The iconography of these altars, including spirals, vegetal motifs, and stylized animals, preserves elements of Latin artistic language even as the monuments adopt Roman shapes and epigraphic conventions. Excavations within the sanctuary precinct uncovered offerings of bronze figurines, small weapons, and glass beads deposited in shallow pits, rituals consistent with indigenous practices that continued beneath the veneer of Roman religious architecture. Rural shrines likewise maintained deep connections to landscape, reinforcing a form of religious ecology that had characterized Gaulish spirituality for centuries. In the uplands of the Morvan and the wooded regions of the Ardennes, numerous small sanctuaries were located near springs, river bends, or prominent geological features. These sites exhibit minimal Roman architectural influence, consisting instead of simple enclosures or open-air platforms. Excavations often recover concentrations of quern stones, fragments of agricultural tools, and offerings of grain, suggesting that rural ritual remained closely tied to subsistence practices and seasonal cycles. Botanical analyses from these contexts show deposits of hazelnuts, barley, and aromatic herbs, reinforcing the role of food offerings in petitioning for agricultural fertility and household protection. The endurance of weapon deposition within sacred contexts, long after the cessation of intertribal warfare, reflects a broader symbolic logic connecting martial identity to communal well-being. At Gurney-sur-Aronde, the latest ritual layers contain intentionally blunted spearheads and shield bosses deposited alongside Roman-denominated coinage, suggesting that the symbolic disarmament of weapons retained significance even as warfare became increasingly regulated under Roman authority. Faunal remains from these layers indicate continued large-scale feasting involving cattle, a practice associated with renewal ceremonies that emphasized social cohesion. The combination of Roman monetary offerings with traditional feasting and weapon deposition demonstrates how Gaulish ritual practice adapted without severing ties to ancestral meanings. Conceptually, these hybrid religious landscapes illustrate a form of cultural continuity operating beneath the surface of imperial administration. The adoption of Roman architectural forms and deities appears less as a transformation of belief than as an expansion of ritual vocabulary. Gaulish spirituality, rooted in relationships between community, landscape, and symbolic action, absorbed these new elements into existing frameworks. The archaeological record reveals a delicate balance: monumental temples rising above ritual pits filled with shattered iron, Latin inscriptions positioned near wooden idols carved with local stylization, and Roman coins deposited alongside offerings of grain and bone. These juxtapositions reflect the lived reality of a society negotiating identity through layered rituals rather than through rigid boundaries. As these practices persisted, they shaped a provincial religious system capable of accommodating both imperial and indigenous identities. This duality would become increasingly important as Gaul entered later phases of Roman rule, when the interplay between tradition and imperial culture formed the spiritual vocabulary through which communities articulated belonging, memory, and collective meaning. By the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, the religious systems of Gaul had matured into a fully integrated provincial tradition where ritual practice, sacred architecture, and communal identity operated simultaneously across Roman and indigenous registers. This synthesis is most clearly revealed in the monumental sanctuary complexes that emerged along key transportation corridors. At Corinth, the sanctuary constructed during the early imperial period stands atop a ritual landscape whose roots extend deep into the late Iron Age. Excavations demonstrate that the Roman-style temple, built with stone podium walls, porticos, and tiled roofing, overlay earlier ceremonial zones where feasting debris, weapon deposits, and animal sacrifices had accumulated over centuries. Soil micromorphology shows that these earlier layers remained undisturbed beneath the temple floor, indicating a deliberate decision by Roman-era builders to embed new structures within sacred ground already marked by ancestral memory. Such continuity suggests that the temple formalized rather than replaced existing sacred geographies. Associated deposits within the Corinth sanctuary further illustrate this interplay. In pits adjacent to the temple walls, archaeologists recovered bronze brooches, miniature tools, and stylized wooden figurines consistent with indigenous votive traditions. Among these offerings were Roman coins, increasingly common during the 2nd century AD, placed alongside locally crafted ceramic vessels used for libations. Chemical analysis of residues within these vessels reveals traces of wine mixed with honey and aromatic herbs, linking Roman consumption practices to older Gaulish ceremonial forms. These combined offerings indicate that worshippers engaged with a unified ritual vocabulary shaped by both imperial and local traditions. Urban contexts present complementary patterns. In Lugdunum, dedications to the imperial cult coexisted with altars honoring syncretized deities revered by local communities. At the sanctuary on Forvier Hill, inscriptions record offerings to Roma and Augustus, yet nearby ex-votos depict stylized human figures carved in traditional Gaulish proportions. The spatial proximity of these materials suggests that worshippers navigated multiple layers of religious meaning within a single architectural complex. Stratigraphic relationships among offerings indicate no strict separation between Roman and Gaulish cults. Instead, ritual acts appear distributed across shared spaces, reflecting a provincial religious mentality comfortable with overlapping identities. Botanical remains recovered from nearby ritual pits, charred barley, hazelnuts, and grape pips, demonstrate that food offerings remained central to devotional practice, maintaining continuity with pre-Roman patterns. Rural sanctuaries continued to anchor community life in ways that differed subtly from urban religious centers. In the upland regions of the Cévennes and the wooded landscapes of the Ardennes, small temple structures often lacked the elaborate masonry of urban complexes, relying instead on timber posts or simple stone foundations. Excavations at several of these sites revealed deposits of agricultural tools, spindle whorls, and iron knives placed within shallow pits, offerings tied to domestic protection, seasonal fertility, and household prosperity. These shrines, typically located near springs, forest clearings, or prominent rock formations, preserved the landscape-oriented spiritual logic of earlier Gaulish religion. Soil chemistry from these locations indicates repeated burning events intermingled with organic remains from food offerings, confirming that ritual gathered families and small communities into intimate cycles of veneration, distinct from the more formalized worship practiced in Roman civic centers. The endurance of healing sanctuaries constitutes another thread of continuity. At Chamalières, where thousands of wooden ex-votos were recovered from thermal springs, the ritual pattern persisted into the 2nd century AD. Wooden figurines carved to represent afflicted limbs, eyes, or torsos were deposited beside Roman coins and small bronze plaques inscribed with Latin appeals. This combination of offerings suggests that the therapeutic dimension of Celtic spirituality, rooted in interactions between water, illness, and divine intercession, remained active even as Roman literacy and administrative culture permeated religious space. Metallurgical analysis of some bronze plaques shows alloy compositions typical of provincial workshops, indicating that local artisans adapted Roman votive forms to suit long-standing ritual needs. These intertwined practices reveal a religious system that responded to the pressures of empire by expanding its symbolic repertoire. The introduction of Roman deities and monumental architecture provided new channels for political expression and civic identity, yet indigenous traditions persisted in shaping how communities conceived of sacred power, ritual efficacy, and communal memory. The archaeological record demonstrates that Gaulish religion did not dissolve under imperial influence. It reoriented, absorbing new forms while maintaining the conceptual foundations that defined ritual life for centuries. Conceptually, the religious evolution of Roman Gaul reflects a broader cultural dynamic in which identity was articulated through layered continuities rather than binary transformations. Temples rose above ancestral sanctuaries, Roman coins joined wooden ex-votos in waterlogged offerings, and syncretized deities bridged cosmological systems without erasing their origins. This multifaceted religious environment shaped the spiritual vocabulary through which provincial communities navigated daily life, political allegiance, and collective belonging. As these practices stabilized, they formed the cultural backdrop for the long-term legacy of the Gauls, a legacy rooted not only in political history and material culture, but in enduring ritual traditions that continued to inform regional identity well beyond the Roman era. The next chapter will explore this legacy in full, tracing the linguistic, cultural, and symbolic threads that connected the ancient Gauls to the societies that emerged in their wake. The legacy of the Gauls extends beyond the dramatic episodes of conquest and resistance that define their encounters with Rome. It persists instead through layers of material culture, linguistic influence, landscape continuity, and symbolic memory that reveal how deeply Celtic traditions shaped Western Europe long after the Iron Age. Archaeological evidence across France, Belgium, and Switzerland demonstrates that many settlement patterns established during the Latine period endured well into the Roman era and beyond. Rural communities continued to occupy valley floors, terrace edges, and upland clearings arranged according to land divisions first established in pre-Roman times. Aerial photography and LiDAR surveys across Burgundy and the Auvergne reveal rectilinear field systems whose alignments correspond to Iron Age boundaries, suggesting long-term persistence in the spatial organization of agricultural land. These systems, preserved beneath later medieval and modern landscapes, reflect a form of rural continuity that outlasted the political structures that created them. Linguistic evidence provides another dimension of Gaulish endurance. Although the Gaulish language gradually receded under the influence of Latin, it left a substratum detectable in regional toponymy and vocabulary. Place names containing elements such as Dunham, Fortified Hill, Magus, Market, or Rightham Ford appear across the former territories of Gaulish tribes, marking settlements whose names survived the linguistic shift imposed by Roman administration. In some regions, hydronyms, names of rivers and streams, retain phonetic patterns associated with Celtic linguistic structures, indicating that these names persisted across centuries of cultural transformation. Even within modern French, a handful of pastoral and agricultural terms bear etymological traces linked to the Gaulish lexicon, illustrating how spoken memory endured through the vocabulary of everyday life. Material culture, likewise, reflects the gradual integration of Celtic traditions into Roman and post-Roman societies. Pottery forms originating in late Latine contexts, particularly certain corseware vessels used for cooking or storage, continued to be produced in provincial workshops well into the 1st centuries AD. Stratigraphic sequences from rural sites show that these indigenous forms coexisted with imported Roman wares, adapting to new functions while preserving traditional shapes. In metalwork, the persistence of specific decorative motifs, spirals, tendrils, and curvilinear designs appears in objects produced by provincial artisans during the Roman period. Although rendered in new materials or framed within Roman stylistic conventions, these motifs draw directly from the iconographic vocabulary developed during the Iron Age, demonstrating a subtle yet sustained continuity in artistic expression. Landscape archaeology offers further insight into how Gaulish practices shaped the structure of later societies. Sacred groves, springs, and hilltop sanctuaries remained focal points of ritual and communal activity even after Roman temples were introduced. Some of these sites continued to be venerated into the early medieval period, eventually becoming locations for Christian chapels or processional routes. Excavations at several such sites reveal that early Christian landscaping preserved the orientation and structural outlines of earlier sanctuaries, embedding Iron Age sacred geographies within new religious frameworks. Soil micromorphology beneath these chapels often contains layers of earlier ritual deposits, burnt offerings, votive fragments, and compacted surfaces, attesting to the depth of their spiritual history. Conceptually, these forms of continuity point to a legacy not defined by political dominance, but by cultural endurance. The Gauls shaped their landscapes through long-term patterns of settlement, agriculture, and ritual that endured and adapted across centuries of imperial rule. Their influence persisted not as a static heritage, but as a set of practices, spatial patterns, and symbolic expressions capable of being woven into successive cultural systems. Such endurance challenges narratives that frame the Roman conquest as a complete rupture. Instead, the archaeological and linguistic records together reveal a process of transformation grounded in absorption, adaptation, and layered continuity. As the 1st centuries AD progressed, the provinces of Gaul moved increasingly into the orbit of Roman political and economic life. Yet the foundations established by earlier Celtic communities remained embedded within the texture of everyday existence. The next section will trace how these foundations continued to inform regional identity through late antiquity and into the early medieval world, revealing the long-term imprint of the Gauls on the cultural and historical development of Western Europe. Through the later Roman period and into late antiquity, the imprint of Gaulish cultural traditions remained visible across the shifting administrative and political structures of Western Europe. As imperial authority reconfigured under the pressures of economic contraction, military redeployment, and administrative fragmentation, the landscapes once shaped by Latine polities continued to anchor provincial life. Excavations at rural settlements in the Seine and Moselle regions demonstrate that agricultural practices established during the Iron Age persisted with remarkable stability. Stratigraphic sequences across these farmsteads reveal granaries rebuilt on traditional post and beam foundations, storage pits lined with clay in older Gaulish fashion, and field systems maintained along boundaries first laid out in the pre-Roman period. Botanical remains from late Roman layers show continued cultivation of barley, spelt, and millet alongside wheat, reflecting a synthesis of Roman agricultural innovations with long-standing regional preferences. Soil micromorphology in these same contexts indicates cyclical fertilization practices, ash spreads, manure deposits, and deliberate fallowing that reflect indigenous land use strategies rather than wholly Roman agronomic models. Urban centers, though more visibly altered by imperial institutions, also preserved older cultural rhythms. At Lyon, Arles, and Trier, the street grids and public monuments of the Roman era gradually accumulated deposits that reveal mixed cultural signatures. In domestic quarters, Gaulish corsuae continued to appear alongside imported ceramics, while hearths were often placed in positions that corresponded to older domestic traditions rather than the hypocaust heated layouts preferred in southern provinces. Inscriptions recovered from late Roman strata record the names of individuals bearing hybrid identities, Latin personal names combined with Celtic cognomina, suggesting that cultural memory persisted even among those integrated into imperial governance. These inscriptions, carved on funerary stelae or dedicatory altars, reveal the coexistence of Roman civic representation with regional identity markers that remained intelligible within local communities. Religious landscapes offer further evidence of this layered continuity. As Christianity spread across Gaul during the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, sacred sites closely associated with Celtic tradition often became focal points for early Christian worship. Excavations beneath medieval churches at Clermont-Ferrand, Chartres, and Saints reveal earlier ritual deposits, burned offerings, pottery fragments, and wooden votives directly beneath Christian foundations. In several cases, the orientation of early churches mirrors the alignment of earlier sanctuaries, suggesting a deliberate effort to integrate new religious structures into established sacred geographies. The persistence of pilgrim pathways along ancient routeways, confirmed through microerosion analysis of stone surfaces and stratigraphic study of roadside shrines, further underscores the endurance of ritual movement across landscapes shaped centuries before. In the symbolic domain, artistic traditions rooted in Latine culture continued to surface in the material expressions of late antiquity and early medieval Gaul. Curvilinear ornament, spirals, triskells, and vegetal scrolls appears on metal brooches, belt fittings, and manuscript illumination produced in the 4th and 5th centuries AD. Metallurgical analyses of brooches from late Roman contexts in Burgundy and the Ardennes reveal continuity in alloy recipes and decorative techniques first established during the Iron Age. While these objects adopt new forms suited to Roman or Christian use, their aesthetic vocabulary carries unmistakable echoes of older Celtic craftsmanship. This persistence of artistic language illustrates how cultural identity could endure through symbol and form even as political systems transformed. Language, too, reveals patterns of continuity that extended into the post-Roman world. While Gaulish eventually ceased to be spoken as a community language, its phonetic and structural influence persisted within the emerging Romance dialects, that would become Old French. Linguistic analysis identifies substratum effects in regional vocabulary associated with agriculture, topography, and domestic life. In river names, hilltop settlements, and rural districts, Gaulish roots remain embedded in toponyms that endured through late antiquity and into the medieval landscape. These names functioned as anchors of regional identity, linking communities to territorial memories whose origins predated Roman rule. Conceptually, the period of late antiquity reveals the Gaulish legacy as a layered phenomenon, one that operated across spatial, linguistic, ritual, and symbolic registers. Even as imperial institutions waned and new political formations emerged, the deeper structures of identity remained tied to patterns inherited from Iron Age society. These patterns, preserved in the forms of settlement, the logic of sacred landscapes, and the persistence of artistic and linguistic motifs, formed part of the cultural substrate from which early medieval Europe developed. As the Roman world collapsed in the 5th century AD, these inherited structures did not disappear. Instead, they provided the foundations upon which new societies, Frankish, Burgundian, Aquitanian, constructed their political and cultural identities. The next section will trace how these long-term continuities shaped medieval perceptions of the Gauls, influencing both historical memory and emerging regional identities across Western Europe. As the political map of Western Europe reorganized in the centuries following the collapse of Roman administration, the memory of the Gauls took on new forms shaped by the needs and identities of emerging kingdoms. These memories, preserved not only through material continuities, but through narrative reinterpretation, reveal how deeply the Gaulish past remained embedded within the cultural frameworks of early medieval society. Archaeological layers from the 5th and 6th centuries AD illustrate a landscape still marked by Iron Age spatial logic. Fortified hilltops remained focal points for settlement, river routes continued to structure regional exchange, and rural communities maintained patterns of field division traceable to centuries-old boundaries. The durability of these spatial forms demonstrates that even dramatic political change rarely altered the deeper structures through which communities understood territory and belonging. In the domains ruled by the Merovingians, material culture reflects an evolving synthesis between inherited traditions and new forms of political representation. Burial assemblages from sites such as Charney, Lavoy, and Inuri feature weaponry, jewelry, and clothing fittings that combine Germanic, Roman, and residual Celtic motifs. Metallurgical studies of brooches and belt plaques reveal decorative vocabularies, scrollwork, escurves, and rhythmic geometric repetition that echo late Latin artistic principles. Though these items were produced centuries after the height of Celtic craftsmanship, their stylistic resonance suggests an enduring aesthetic substrate that continued to influence the visual language of status and identity in early medieval Gaul. Historical writing from the same period further demonstrates the persistence of Gaulish memory. In the 6th century AD, Gregory of Tours, a bishop deeply embedded in the Merovingian political sphere, wrote of the Gauls as ancestral inhabitants whose legacy shaped the foundations of the Frankish kingdom. While his narrative reframed the Gauls within a Christian and dynastic context, it preserved the idea of a distinct regional identity stretching back before Roman rule. Such textual echoes, although filtered through theological and political lenses, reveal that the memory of Celtic Gaul did not vanish in the face of new ethnic and political formations. Instead, it lingered in the conceptual frameworks through which medieval writers interpreted their own landscapes and genealogies. Ritual practices similarly reveal strands of inherited tradition. Excavations beneath early churches in the Loire Valley and Burgundy frequently uncover deeper layers of votive activity, offerings of pottery, iron tools, or carved wooden objects, dating to the late Roman and early medieval periods. Soil micromorphology shows patterns of repeated burning and deposition analogous to earlier Gaulish rituals, suggesting that certain protective or commemorative practices continued in localized forms even as Christianity reshaped formal liturgy. These continuities reflect a cultural logic in which sacred landscapes, rather than being abandoned, were reinterpreted within new theological frameworks. Springs, hilltops, and grove sites that once served as focal points for Celtic ritual often became locations for shrines or chapels, preserving the spatial memory of sacredness across religious transformations. Linguistic continuity also shaped medieval identity. The persistence of Gaulish toponyms, hillfort names containing Dunon, market towns built on sites once called Magus, rivers bearing pre-Roman roots, provided everyday reminders of a deep historical landscape. These names appeared in charters, boundary descriptions, and ecclesiastical records, anchoring medieval administrative geography in terms inherited from the Iron Age. Their survival through centuries of political change indicates the durability of local memory systems that operated independently of written history, carried forward through oral tradition and communal usage. Conceptually, the legacy of the Gauls in medieval Europe can be understood as a set of structural continuities rather than a direct lineage of institutions. Their influence persisted in the organization of land, the shape of settlements, the contours of sacred geography, the rhythms of agricultural life, and the symbolic vocabularies of art and identity. These continuities shaped the cultural environment in which new kingdoms emerged, providing a framework of memory that survived long after the specific political forms of Iron Age Gaul had disappeared. By the early medieval period, the Gaulish past had become both distant and present, distant in its political structures, yet present in the landscapes, languages, and symbolic systems that continued to shape daily life. The layers of archaeological evidence, linguistic residue, ritual continuity, and spatial inheritance reveal a legacy not erased by conquest but woven into the fabric of Western Europe. Through these enduring threads, the world of the Gauls remained a quiet but persistent foundation beneath the societies that followed. Across the landscapes once shaped by Celtic fields, fortified hills, and ritual enclosures, the traces of Gaul persist in the quiet structure of the countryside itself. In the curve of a terraced slope, the alignment of an old river crossing, the faint imprint of ancient roadways beneath modern soil. Excavations and inscriptions allow fragments of this world to resurface, yet much of its character endures less through artifact than through the long continuity of human presence on the same ground. As dusk settles over the valleys of Burgundy or the plateaus of the Auvergne, the stillness of the terrain recalls the depth of time layered beneath it, where centuries of settlement, ceremony, and memory remain folded into the earth. In this steady, unbroken landscape, the legacy of the Gauls persists not as a vanished civilization, but as a quiet foundation beneath the present, shaping the rhythms of place long after the names of its tribes have faded into history.